Let's just say that he needed a little help to scrape an E for his potions owl back in the day. And we should be able to have a more civilized party with guests sometime later in the term, Sloane began, and Holly had to call on all her willpower and experience with history of magic not to drone off. The evening didn't really improve from there. The food was nice, mostly French cuisine, though presumably cooked by the house elves all the same, and Sloane himself was fine. The problem was that, aside from Neville, Ron, Hermione, and Ginny, everyone else was the sort of stuck-up twit Holly would rather hex herself than voluntarily spend 5 minutes with. Remembering Dumbledore's task, to get the real memory of what he'd told Voldemort about Horcruxes from Sloane, Holly just about managed to make polite conversation. She did have to elbow Ron and Ginny occasionally to get them to play along, but her growing reputation as a powerful witch, bolstered by things like the Prophet article about the attack on Diagon Alley and her victory in the Triwizard Tournament, was that even Cormac McLaggen wasn't very keen to offend her to her face. "Tell me, Holly, did the dueling competition last year really end in a double knockout between you and the Bowsbatons champion?" "It sounds like quite the extraordinary story," Sloane said. "Well, I gambled on being able to dodge her spell instead of trying another shield. I got another stunner off, but dodging a spell at 10 paces is tricky business," Holly said. I'll say. Blaise, how is your mother doing?" "I'm afraid our correspondence was interrupted, but last I'd heard she was working on a new greenhouse for her South American collection. Very pleased with it. I'll tell her you can be reached by Owl again, she always enjoyed your letters," Blaise said. "Excellent, my boy. Do try some of this, the Hogwarts house elves will take any chance to show off. I've got quite a few connections down there still, and some fine brandy will get you a feast worthy of a king," Sloane said. Sloane's conversations with Ron and Ginny were short and awkward, and Holly knew he was struggling to pretend that they hadn't really been invited because they were her friends. Hermione, he did seem genuinely interested in, and the two of them chatted animatedly about some obscure facet of potions for a good 5 minutes. "Not a bad evening, huh?" McLaggen said after the dinner had wound down, and Holly blinked when she realized he was talking to her. She was sure she'd been very clear to him last year when she'd told him exactly how little she thought of him. "It's getting rapidly worse the more time I spend in your presence," Holly said. "Fine, fuck off then, you weirdo." "I was only trying to make conversation," McLaggen said, turning around in a huff. Holly kept walking and picked up her pace to catch back up with her friends. "Merlin, did he have to pick the least interesting people in the whole castle?" "The only one of that lot I'd speak to voluntarily is the one who sleeps 2 beds over from me," Ron said, shaking his head. "I can't believe I was annoyed at not getting into that as anything but your girlfriend, Holly. If I ever want to be one of them again, hex me," Ginny said. "I thought Professor Sloane was quite interesting," Hermione said. "Well, there's nothing wrong with him, I suppose. It's just, sitting across from Cormac McLaggen for 2 hours is not my idea of a fun evening," Holly said. Hermione gave her a sympathetic little nod. The rest of Holly's second week back at Hogwarts passed much the same as the first, though she found with a start that potions was quickly becoming one of her favorite classes. After Snape had stopped bothering her in particular, it had become bearable, but Sloane's teaching transformed the subject. Holly was learning not just a simple technique or recipe, as Snape had taught, but why they stirred 13 times counterclockwise in one potion and 7 times clockwise in another. There were now daily wand checks, which, as Holly had predicted, were defeated in about a day, but life at Hogwarts was still much the same as ever. Holly felt herself get immersed in the familiar rhythm of classes and Quidditch practice and Gryffindor Tower again, and she couldn't help but feel like she'd just come home after a long time away. Grimmauld Place was her home now, in a way Privet Drive had never been, but there would be a part of her, she thought, that would always call this old castle home. She was not so overwhelmed with wonder as she had once been. Now she noticed the empty classrooms, the bare stone walls. The way that the Great Hall looked curiously empty, from the right angle, even when every student in the castle was there. The castle itself was old, too, a vast edifice of bare stone and ramshackle modifications. Her classes were as easy as they had been at the end of last year, if not more so. Her strange ability to master spells with frightening ease and speed, the way it sometimes seemed to her that she'd sat through these lessons once before. She felt that way more and more often, these days. She had first noticed it, first called on it, during her second year. She'd been so consumed with anger and fear that she'd truly intended to murder the heir of Slytherin. She'd worked herself to the bone to master every curse she could find with her cloak, and they had come easily to her. When she'd killed Crouch in the graveyard, when she'd called all her hate and rage and thrust them into a curse, it had been easy. The words had almost leapt off her lips, and she'd barely had to move her wand. It had been so very familiar. It had been like she'd cast the killing curse 100 times. She had wondered, before the graveyard, why the killing curse was so often referred to as the worst of the three. Painless, quick death seemed so ordinary compared to the unimaginable pain of the Cruciatus curse, or the violation of the Imperius. Now she knew. Now she the kind of hate, not righteous anger, not burning rage, but cold hate required to cast it. The way you had to want, with every fiber of your being, for another human being to die. You all right, mate? Ron asked, and Holly found herself back in the waking world. She'd barely gotten any sleep last night, her dreams plagued by surreal nightmares, and she'd accidentally nodded off 5 minutes into charms. Yeah. Just didn't get much sleep last night, Holly said. She looked down at her wand, sitting on her desk. The slim, varnished bit of wood, of Holly, her namesake, looked like most of the other wands in the classroom. It bore no ground gems or special embellishments, though Holly was well aware of how much magical knowledge, how many centuries of work, had been required to create something like it. All that made notable was inside of it, the single phoenix feather that served as its core. A feather from the same bird as Voldemort's. She had met Fawkes, he'd saved her life once, down in the chamber. She'd heard his song, and it had given her strength when she'd had none. What, she wondered, did Fawkes think of the use his feather had been put to? A phoenix was as intelligent as any human, and they gave their feathers to wand makers only rarely. Holly wondered why he'd given a second feather, after what had been done with the first. As charms class wound up, Professor Flitwick approached Holly. The short man, a former champion duelist and an excellent teacher by any measure, smiled at her as he stood next to her desk. Everyone else had already gotten up to 11. "Everything all right, Miss Potter?" he asked, his voice quiet and gentle. "Fine. Just tired," Holly said, returning his smile. "Well, that's something of a tradition for your AL year. But most students generally wait until nearer to exam season." "The headmaster would like to see you in his office after dinner," Flitwick said, and Holly nodded. "I'll be there." "Thanks, sir," Holly said, and she put her books and stationery back in her bag with a quick flick of her wand. That evening, she walked all the way up the grand staircase. There were numerous new portraits of Olderers and hit wizards lining the walls all throughout the castle, keeping a watchful eye out for any troublemaking. Apparently, the school portraits were too frivolous to be trusted with such a task. The way to Dumbledore's office was still guarded by only the stone gargoyle and a password, "Pepper Imps this month." Trying to station guards outside of it would have been too silly for even the Ministry, who were still pressing ahead with wand checks that a first year could defeat. It would, Holly thought, be a little like posting guards outside of a dragon's lair for the protection of the dragon. Dumbledore sat behind his desk, staring deeply into an odd contraption of whirring gears and ethereal strands of golden light. He looked up as Holly entered the office, his eyes twinkling in the light of the many floating candles. "It is good to see you, Holly. Tell me, do you recognize this?" he asked, pointing to the device. No sir," Holly said, honestly. She had no idea what any of the bizarre contraptions that littered Dumbledore's office were. "A pity. It's really a rather wonderful thing, which we have no time for tonight." "Please, take a seat," he said, waving his wand lazily through the air. The device was lifted gently off his desk and put back on a shelf, whilst a comfortable-looking armchair was conjured in front of the desk for Holly to sit down in. "What are we doing tonight, sir?" Holly asked. "I do have yet more to teach you, having been around for a good long while. But first, we'll be taking another stroll down memory lane," Dumbledore said, summoning his pensive with a click of his fingers. "And whose memory is it?" "Bob Ogden. An old ally of mine, who I was able to convince to lend me these memories before he died. He was once a rising star in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, a very long time ago," Dumbledore said, as he emptied out a small crystal phial full of a silvery liquid into the runed basin. Holly looked into the basin and felt the world fall away around her. Chapter 89, Year 5, Chapter 16. Chapter Text. Holly spotted Bob Ogden right away. He wore the sort of odd, mismatched outfit that most raised in the wizarding world resorted to when they tried to blend in with muggles. His was more bizarre than most, a frock coat and spats over a striped one-piece bathing costume. Dumbledore stood beside her and smiled as he took in Ogden's odd appearance. Bob was never one to blend in well with muggles, alas. Would you believe that he received an outstanding Muggle Studies NEWT? Dumbledore asked her, and Holly sighed. Yeah, I would, she said, and looked around some more. They were standing in a country lane, with tall hedgerows to either side of them. The lane itself was old and weathered, and Holly felt a faint breeze against her skin, though it wasn't quite as if she was standing here on that summer's day so long ago. There was wind, yes, there was the soft heat of the midday sun beating down on them, but it was all just the slightest bit muted. Like, Holly thought, a television turned down just too low or a song heard through a closed door. Her mind whirled as she tried to reason why. The memory the diary had shown her, so long ago, hadn't felt like this, muted and quiet and so on. Was it the age of the memory? Perhaps whatever silvery liquid Dumbledore used to store memories for his Pensieve was less resistant to the ravages of time than the diary had been, or maybe it was Ogden. Were his eyes less sharp, his hearing less adept, than her own? Holly's musings ended when they approached a sign that looked much newer than the rest of the lane. It was made of wood, and the paint was still fresh. Her hand shook for a moment as she realized where they were, Little Hangleton. As they rounded the corner she saw the graveyard. It looked different in the light of day, even accounting for all the years between this memory and her experience there. She could still see the statue of death, the robed figure clutching the scythe she had animated to strike at Voldemort. The statue seemed almost to be looking at her, the empty eye sockets of the skull. She tore her vision away from it, and stared instead at the large black dog standing near it. Its shaggy fur, yellow eyes, and long teeth were all very familiar to her, even at this distance. Professor, is that a Holly said, turning to Dumbledore for a moment before turning back to point out the dog, only for it to be gone. What do you see, Holly? Dumbledore asked her, and she shook her head. I thought I saw a dog, like Sirius's form, almost, near the graveyard. I guess I must just be seeing things, Holly said. Let us check, Dumbledore said, and he raised his hand. The memory started to flow backwards, and Holly saw nothing near the statue, and indeed, it seemed far more ordinary. Had she just been imagining the way those empty sockets had seemed to be staring at her? She had seen the dog before, though some of those times had been serious. Some, but not all. I guess I must have not gotten a lot of sleep or something, Holly said, her cheeks flushing. She didn't want Dumbledore to think she was going crazy. Memory is a curious thing, Holly. It can be imprecise, vulnerable to manipulation. Still, let us press forward. This memory is a vital one, Dumbledore said, and they followed Ogden further down the country lane. The hedgerows grew wilder and wilder, more unkempt and full of prickly thorns, with each step they took after him. They had a view of the whole valley, then, of the picturesque little village, of the gleaming manor on the hill. The Riddle house was surrounded by a wide expanse of green lawn, the exact picture of any respectable country gentry's abode. They turned away from the pretty village and the well-kept manor, instead journeying down a shadowed lane. The lane itself was unkempt here, full of potholes and missing stones, and Holly saw their ultimate destination for the first time. It was hidden mostly behind a thick copse of dark trees, swaying in the gentle breeze, but something about the rickety house behind them stood out to her. It seemed to loom, drawing the shadows to it to keep it cloaked in darkness even as the noonday sun beat down upon them. I can feel the wards even from here, even in a memory, Holly whispered. They were powerful, and she knew somehow that this was the exact nexus she had drawn on in the graveyard. This was where the ley lines met, what gave such magical power to the area around it. Yet, as powerful and as noticeable as they were, there was an age to them. A sense of decay, as if she were looking at a proud ruin of a castle, with only the smallest part still inhabited, rather than an intact keep. This was once a place of great power, I believe. Even before Salazar Slytherin made his home here. Wizarding legend says that Harpo the Foul had a hiding place here, or that it was home to a coven of murderous druids, Dumbledore said, his tone almost light, as they followed Ogden down the path towards the house hidden by the trees. The house itself did not look nearly that old. For the most part, it did look old, but only of an age to the village and the manor, mostly. But there was a crumbled stone tower to the side and a circle of stones to the other. Bob Ogden seemed to take a moment to gather his courage, and then he approached the house. He stopped at the ward line, marked by a rusting iron gate and a crumbling stone fence. Holly could feel it even more strongly now, feel that curses and crackling power ready to strike at any intruder. There was a door knocker in the shape of a coiled snake, and Ogden knocked on the wrought iron gate once, twice, 3 times before someone emerged from the shadows. The man was dressed in little more than dirty rags, though they might once have been fine robes. His hair and beard were wild, matted and thick, and his eyes seemed alight with a wild energy. "You're not welcome," the man hissed, and Holly realized with a start that he was speaking in Parcel tongue, and more than that, that he was infusing the words with his will as if Ogden was a snake he meant to command. Good morning. I'm from the Ministry of Mag," Ogden began, nervously fiddling with his wand. "Leave," the man hissed once more, a wand in one hand and a long, gleaming knife slick with dark blood in the other. I'm terribly afraid I can't understand you." Perhaps they're a member of the household who speaks English?" Ogden asked, still standing well back of the ward line. "You understand him, I'm sure?" Dumbledore asked. "Yeah. He's putting his will into it like Ogden was a snake he wanted to order around," Holly said. "Fascinating," Dumbledore said, though anything else he wanted to say would have to wait because the man raised his wand and hissed. A bolt of sickly yellow light flew towards Ogden, who hurriedly deflected it into a nearby hedgerow. "Now see here," Ogden began, only to be drowned out by another voice. "Morphin," another man shouted, emerging from the run-down house. Holly watched in mute, sickened fascination as Ogden tried in vain to explain why he was there. "Morphin Gaunt," and it emerged, "Hexter Muggle boy." He crossed the ward line somewhat hesitantly, after the elder Gaunt let him through, and Holly felt her breath hitch as entered the house and got a look at the third Gaunt. Mayrup Gaunt was deathly pale, with a plain, almost dull face and lank black hair. She wore a thin grey dress, and though she was a little cleaner than the two men, her pale skin was mottled with faded bruises. One, on her face, was clearly recent and especially ugly. Her eyes were fearful, like a cornered animal, but they had the same wild energy as her brother's. Her hands shook a little as she stirred a large black cauldron over a roaring fire, and sweat beaded down her forehead. Holly recognized the way Mayrup struggled to hold her hands still, the way her eyes were slightly out of focus. Moody had shown them all numerous wizarding photographs of the consequences of repeated applications of Cruciatus Curse during Holly's 4th year at Hogwarts. She wanted to look away, but all Holly could do was stare at the girl's reflection in the mirror. She couldn't be more than a year or two older than her, if that. "See this, boy? Know who we are, know whose blood runs in our veins," shouted the elder Gaunt, Marvolo, as he made a rude hand gesture toward Ogden. Holly whirled around, eager for something to look at other than Voldemort's mother. No, Holly realized, he was showing him a ring on his middle finger. It was made out of some grimy metal, silver perhaps, and set with a huge black stone. Something about it seemed almost familiar to her, and somehow it was not nearly so dimmed and muted as the rest of the memory. "Mr. Gaunt, I've really no idea. This is Peevrill's ring. I could buy your entire department of mudbloods for what I've been offered for it, boy." Marvolo Gaunt shouted, and then he held out his hand. Mayrup screamed as she was wrenched off her feet, her hands trying to fight something around her neck. She came to a stop near Marvolo, and he gripped her by a golden chain, showing Ogden the locket at the end of it. Holly recognized the locket, of course. She had seen in Lucius Malfoy's memories, seen it overtake Draco Malfoy even as he was moments from destroying it. "Mr. Gaunt, please unharmed. This is Slytherin's. Surely even a mudblood like you has heard of him, boy. Surely, you understand what it means to have his blood. The teacher of Merlin, the founder of Hogwarts, the scourge of the witch hunters, surely you know." Marvolo screamed, his eyes alight with manic energy. He released Mayrup, and she scrambled away, massaging her neck. Ogden tried in vain to explain that Morphin was to attend a hearing at the Ministry, for hexing a Muggle, for several more minutes before there was another interruption. The sound of hooves on the uneven lane, of laughter and conversation, were plainly audible through the open window. "It's not ours, darling. Belongs to some tramp by the name of Gaunt, him and his mad children. The son is a terror, always walking around with a bloody knife and nailing snakes to their gate, and the daughter, well," a man with a posh voice said, and a woman giggled. "Oh, I've heard what they say about her," the woman said, still giggling. "Darling. Darling," he called her. "He wouldn't have you anyway," Sister Morphine whispered, his full of malicious glee. Mayrup just looked away from him, the cauldron over the fire entirely forgotten as she tried to become as small as she could. "What? What did you say, Morphine?" hissed Marvolo. "She likes looking at that muggle. The little lordling up in his manor, she waits for him to come by, peers through the hedge at him. Last night she was hanging out a window, waiting for him to ride home. But I got him, hexed him till he wasn't so pretty. Is that true, daughter? My pure-blooded daughter, who carries the blood of Slytherin in her veins, lusting for a muggle. For a filthy, dirt-veined muggle?" Marvolo asked, his voice level in a way that Holly knew was far worse than the way he'd shouted at Ogden. Mayrup didn't speak, just shaking her head and looking away, crying softly. Marvolo exploded in rage, striking Mayrup across the face and sending her sprawling to the floor. Morphine cackled, and as Marvolo raised his wand once more, Ogden stepped forward. "Now that's quite enough, Mr. Gaunt," he shouted, and Marvolo whirled on him. He hissed, and a hex flew towards the Ministry wizard. Ogden deflected it and started to make his way out of the house. Morphine joined in, but neither of them escalated beyond simple hexes and jinxes. Holly and Dumbledore followed Ogden, and then the memory faded around them. Holly found herself back in the headmaster's office, feeling rather sick. She had known the basics of Mayrup Gaunt before, that she had ensorcelled Tom Riddle Sr., an awful crime, and that she had learned such a thing from her family. Now, Holly understood what Dumbledore had been saying. She could find very little hate, very little of anything but pity for Mayrup Gaunt. "What happened after that?" Holly asked. Ogden returned with a squad of hit wizards, and both Marvolo and Morphine spent some time in Azkaban. Mayrup married Tom Riddle Sr. not long after her father and brother's arrest, likely through a love potion or perhaps the Imperious Curse. Marvolo returned from Azkaban after some months, and never saw his children again. Mayrup died some time later, her body too weak to handle giving birth to her son, and Tom Riddle was given to an orphanage. His father, as far as I can gather, never once looked for him, or gave him much thought. He returned some time before the birth, claiming that he had been hoodwinked, Dumbledore explained. "The locket, do you think Voldemort made another memory? Another thing like that, and the diary, out of the ring?" Holly asked. "I do," Dumbledore said, gravely. Wheels spun inside Holly's mind, and she considered for a moment before she spoke again. "The diary, the locket, is that what a Horcrux is?" she asked, her voice quiet. "They are, yes. Promise you will not look any further into such things. I will explain them to you in due time, and you will find nothing about them in the Hogwarts library," Dumbledore said. "I promise." "But, if you want me to get Sloane to tell me what he told Riddle," Holly said, "I shall have to explain to you what they are." "I am aware, Holly. Horcruxes are the darkest of magics, the evilest of the dark arts. I did not want, I still do not want, to have that conversation with you while you were a student. Circumstances, however, have forced my hand. And, on that topic, we still have a practical lesson to undertake. If you would take my arm," Dumbledore said, offering his arm to Holly. She took it, and forks flew over towards them. They disappeared in a flash of flame, and Holly found herself standing on a familiar bare island of rock in the midst of the sea. A storm raged around them, rain and wind whipping at the desolate island, and lightning flashed in the distance. She had been here once before when Dumbledore had first started training her for the Triwizard Tournament. "Sir?" Holly asked, a little unsure what she'd be learning that would require them to be so removed from anything else. "Horcruxes are nearly impossible to destroy with magic or any other means. When you slew the basilisk with Gryffindor's sword, the goblin silver that made up its blade absorbed the snake's venom, one of the few things capable of destroying a Horcrux. It is my hope that we will have access to it when we hunt down the ring and the others. Should we lack it, however, there is one spell that can destroy one, a spell too dangerous for me to perform in a place defended by the spells and enchantments of a true Parselmouth, Dumbledore explained, and Holly felt her blood go cold. He could only be referring to one spell, a spell Holly had never cast, yet one she had used to kill a Death Eater at the Quidditch World Cup. Finfir, Holly whispered, so low that her voice would have been lost in the roar of the storm and the rain were it not for whatever spell Dumbledore had cast to let them hear one another. Indeed. Watch closely, Holly, and remember, you must keep the image of a snake in your head when you cast it. Only Parseltongue will control the flames, and only then if they are made to resemble creatures beholden to it, Dumbledore said. Why do you have to control it like that? She asked. Finfir was invited by Hippo the Foul, a Greek dark wizard and a Parselmouth. It predates even the weaker Roman wands, though it may be conjured by one. Hippo was paranoid about his inventions being turned against him, and so he hid a trap in his most powerful curse, that it could not be controlled by any means other than Parseltongue. And, as you know, whilst one can memorize the sounds to gain basic control over the curse, a true Parselmouth can take control at any time. And they'll listen only to their master, if made by a true Parselmouth, like the basilisk, Holly said. Exactly, which is why despite my deep reservations, I must teach this curse to you if we are to use it in a place Voldemort has defended, or around a Horcrux. The memory within would otherwise be able to defend itself, to turn the curse against us. Now, the incantation is, Dumbledore began, but Holly could no longer hear him. The whispers had begun again, louder and louder until she could no longer watch anything else. She sank into them, drinking greedily of the knowledge they offered. She spoke words in the tongue of serpents, commanding them to come forth, to obey her will. She felt rage within her, not the cold hate of the killing curse, but white-hot rage. The desire to destroy, to burn the world to ashes. To rule over the embers, if she could not have what she desired. She grasped wild magic, the magic of the storm around them, of the ocean, her own power. She suffused it with her will, with the image of a serpent, with her burning rage. She raised her phoenix feather wand above her head and whirled it around her and Dumbledore. Fire, at first bright blue but then vibrant crimson, sprang from it like a whip. The scent of ash and brimstone was overpowering, the smell of the ocean completely overpowered, as a titanic serpent emerged from Holly's wand. More followed, circling around her and Dumbledore. She had kept the image in her mind, an image she would never forget, the Basilisk of Slytherin, the one she had slain all those years ago. Now it would listen only to her. By right of conquest, by her killing of the memory of Tom, the beast would obey her. The cursed fire hissed at her, swearing loyalty to Holly. They asked what they should destroy, and Holly commanded them to do nothing. The cursed fire strained at her will, trying to break free to devour her, to devour Dumbledore, to devour even the sea itself. I know the incantation, Professor Holly said, her voice flat and calm as the serpents of cursed fire bathed them both in crimson light and the smell of brimstone. I see, Dumbledore said, his voice soft and full of sadness. Chapter 90, Year 5, Chapter 17. Chapter text. You all right, mate? Ron asked as Holly stepped back through the portrait hole into the Gryffindor common room. Not really, Holly said, weakly. Her voice was unsteady, and she hated it. Luckily, it was late on a Sunday night, and few people were still in the common room. That bad, huh? Ron said, and Holly smiled a little. Can you talk about it? Hermione asked, and Holly paused as Ginny came down the stairs from the girls' dorms. Let me see how you're getting along with your occlumency, Holly said, and Hermione's eyes widened a little before she nodded. Holly caught her gaze, and pushed a probe of will and thought down it. She was met with defenses, and not just the active mind clearing that was the most basic form of occlumency. Then her eyes met the gaze of two Weasleys, and after a moment Holly nodded. Can you tell us about it, now? Hermione asked. Holly cast a spell to ward off any eavesdroppers and nodded. Yeah. You're all good enough to stop someone rummaging around without being noticed, so I can tell you some of it, Holly said, moving to sit by the dying embers of the fire. So what have you been learning up there? More spells, like last year? Ginny asked. Well, sort of. Dumbledore, he taught me a spell, this time. To destroy another diary, or lock it, if we have to without the sword, Holly said, hoping her cleaning spells had gotten rid of the scent of brimstone that had seemed to cling to her afterwards. Her skin was still a little red and irritated from the repeated applications. Wicked, Ron said. I suppose that makes sense, though why can't Dumbledore just cast it himself? Hermione asked. It needs a Parselmouth to cast it, to be safe around another Parselmouth, Holly said quietly, and all three of her friends seemed to realize what spell she was talking about, all of them, she knew, remembering the Quidditch World Cup. Is that what? Ginny began, not quite sure what to say, but Holly shook her head. Her girlfriend leant against her, one comforting hand on Holly's opposite shoulder. It's not that, I guess. We've been looking at memories, Holly said. Memories? Ron asked, confused. About Voldemort. This one was of his family on his mother's side, the ones descended from Slytherin. The things her family had done to his mother, and the things she did to his father, Holly explained. The four of them talked for some time as Holly explained what she knew of Voldemort's past, and none of them slept easily that night. Holly, especially, found it hard to get the image of Mayrup Gaunt's shaking hands and bruised face out of her mind. What Mayrup had gone on to do, the way she had bent Tom Riddle Sr. to her will, controlled him in an awful violation. It stuck with Holly, a gnawing thing in the back of her mind. She got little sleep that night, and the nights after it were often full of nightmares and visions of a dark, decaying house and the shadow of a crumbling tower. The weather seemed to sense her mood, and all traces of summer, or even, it seemed sometimes, sunshine, had disappeared into a relentless march of grey skies and pouring rain. Angelina Johnson was perhaps less of a Quidditch fanatic than Oliver would have been, but only slightly. She drove the Gryffindors hard, and Holly threw herself into the punishing training sessions gladly. When she snapped into a turn at 100 miles an hour in the pouring rain, she couldn't think about Voldemort, about her own worries. She could only think about the moment, about making the turn and staying with the practice snitch. Holly had always been an excellent flyer, and she had only gotten better with practice, and with her animagus form. Now, she understood the wind in a way she never had before, could coax her broom to do things it wasn't quite enchanted to do, the magic of her animal form, that she had grafted to herself with the crucible of a thunderstorm, interacting in odd ways with the enchantments on the broom. Nice flying, Miss, said the black-uniformed hit wizard assigned to watch over the Gryffindor team's practices, or, in other words, assigned to watch over Holly whilst she was on the grounds. He was a new addition to the stands and had clearly charmed his cap and cloak imperturbable. Sure, thanks. Sorry about making you stand out in the rain, Holly said as she touched down gently on the muddy ground of the pitch. That's the job. I'm a dab hand at warming charms, though, he said, and Holly smiled. The next day, Holly had potions first thing in the morning. Unlike all her previous years at Hogwarts, this provoked no cries of horror or wails of despair. Sloane was proving to be an excellent teacher, and more than that, an entertaining one. Holly found herself captivated by his lessons in a way she had never expected to be. Potions was one of the few subjects where her uncanny ability to learn magic, where the powers Voldemort granted her when he failed to kill her as a baby, did very little for her. Whatever mark she earned in potions, whatever she learned, was the product of her own efforts. It pushed her to try harder, and that reflected in her grades. Yes, that looks quite right, Miss Potter. An excellent shade, of course, and, Sloane said as he walked past Holly's cauldron, pausing for a moment to sniff at it. And just the right odor of troll blood. I understand you got into a scrap with one right in your first year. Sloane asked her. Yeah. Well, I mostly distracted it. It was Ron who beat it, really, Holly said, trying to combat her instinct to downplay the incident. She still had to worm her way into Sloane's confidence, and she was beginning to understand just how important the task Dumbledore had given her was. Or, at least, how important he thought it was. Really? Forgive me for asking, but I'm rather stumped how any first year could defeat such a beast. Levitation charm on the Troll's Own Club, Holly said, adding the 3 drops of dragon's blood she'd worked out her plant growth potion needed. The recipes in their books only called for 2, but that was a concession to ease of use. If she kept the temperature just right, 3 drops would make a much more effective potion. At 11, is this true, Mr. Weasley? Sloane said, and Ron flushed a little. I was mostly trying to stop him from whacking me with it, to be honest, Ron said. Yes, well, we shall have to discuss this at this week's dinner. You will both come, won't you? We've a rather special guest, you see, Sloane said, looking like a little boy who'd been left unsupervised in a sweets shop. Of course, sir, Holly said, as she turned down the flame on her burner just a little. As she did so, Sloane gave her the tiniest look of approval. Evidently, he'd noticed that she'd need to make the change and had been waiting for her to notice it too. Their plant growth potions were graded by being poured on a number of sickly-looking plants in small pots that had clearly been purchased from a Muggle garden center. Ron's potion turned his plant into a fearsome, spiky thing, but one that looked just as near death. Holly and Hermione both managed to get their plant to look much better, and for it to grow significantly. Lavender Brown had made a mistake with her troll blood, and when she poured her phial of potion onto the plant, it withered and blackened for just a moment before dissolving. Sloane quickly vanished the rest of her potion, but instead of mocking or snapping at her, like Snape would have, he walked her through what had gone wrong and how to fix it. After everyone had demonstrated their potions, Sloane had them put the best-performing ones into crystal vials for use by the herbology department and the elves, who maintained greenhouses of their own, to grow some of the enormous numbers of vegetables they needed to feed the students every day. Holly had grown to suspect that the potions masters very carefully planned their lessons so that large quantities of potions that needed to be brewed could be available when needed. There were very few wizarding settlements the size of Hogwarts in Britain, and most of them had enough adult potion brewers to manage. If Sloane or Snape had been charged with making all the plant growth and pepper-up potions the castle ran through, they would probably have gone mad. Can we go flying tonight? Ginny asked Holly quietly as they passed each other in the corridors. Sure, Holly said. Ginny, like Holly, had a bird as an animagus form. Both of them loved flying, of course, but Holly thought there was more to it than that. Plenty of wizards and witches loved flying but had earthbound animagus forms. She had read once that it reflected a desire for freedom, but she wasn't sure that was true, either. A large, green-eyed raven and an orange-eyed goshawk flew from Gryffindor Tower that night, circling over the empty grounds. Their dance was one of air currents and winds, dashing through the old stones of the castle. There was a thrill to something as simple as sneaking out, now that the Ministry had posted guards at every corner of Hogwarts. Holly saw them as she flew across the grounds, small figures, huddled up in their cloaks for warmth. They were mostly ordinary members of the Magical Law Enforcement Patrol, the sort of people who arrested brawling drunks outside the Three Broomsticks or inspected cauldron thickness rather than fighting dark wizards. Holly's mind wandered as she looked at them, thinking how easy it would be to slip through their patrols, their guard posts. She wouldn't even need her cloak, even on a night like this. Then Ginny dived at her, and Holly forgot about the wizards below and returned to the freedom of the air. Around half an hour later, Ginny led her to a flat spot on the roof, with an excellent view of the lake. It was a full moon night, and the ghostly silver light played across the still surface of the black lake with almost breathtaking clarity. The two of them turned back into their own forms, and Holly took her girlfriend's hand in her own as they sat down and gazed out onto the grounds. "Thank you, for this." "For everything," Holly whispered, though they were far from any patrolling teacher or guard. "Dumbledore would stop those lessons, if you asked him," Ginny whispered back. Here, in the depth of night and alone, they could talk about things like this. They had always had places and times like this, not quite in the waking world, far enough away to talk without reservation and close enough to be safe. "I know," Holly said, staring out at the reflection of the moon as something disturbed the flat surface of the lake. "Sometimes you're too brave for your own good," Ginny said, leaning against Holly. Though the wind was only a soft breeze, it was still bitterly cold and Holly appreciated the warmth of her girlfriend leaning against her. "I know that too." "Of course you do," Ginny said fondly. "You better not leave me behind, you know," Ginny continued after a moment. "I promise," Holly said, and then she kissed Ginny. For just a while, Holly could forget all the nightmares waiting for her when she went to sleep. Holly found herself curious to know who Sloane's mystery dinner guest was, despite herself. He held Slug Club dinners every other week unless there was some fancier event planned. The house elves made fancier food, wine was served, and Holly endured them to get closer to Sloane. She certainly didn't attend for Cormac McLagan's charming dinner conversation. But there was something about the look the potions master had when he talked about that week's dinner that made her want to know. It was a mystery, and that was enough for some hardwired piece of her brain to drive her to find out. Holly solved the mystery 30 minutes before the dinner when she saw a carriage approach the grounds outer window. It was pulled by beautiful pale white-winged horses and marked with a golden ministry seal. 4 hit wizards on broomsticks flew alongside it, in a clear escort formation. Rufus Scrimger was coming to Hogwarts, and Holly had an awful feeling it wasn't just to have dinner with Professor Sloane. Chapter 91, Year 5, Chapter 18. Chapter Text. That night's Slug Club dinner was outwardly the same as the previous few Holly had attended so far this year, but the pair of Aurors, not just Hittizards, but actual Aurors, outside the door to Sloane's office put that idea to bed. Holly didn't recognize them, but they nodded at her respectfully as she approached. "Just go right on in," one of them said, her voice calm and posh sounding. She was perhaps 30 and was wearing a pair of golden-framed glasses with tiny glittering runes carved into them. Holly guessed that they must be a more portable form of the magic used to make Mad-Eye Moody's eyeball. Sloane's office was done up much as it had been for the previous Slug Club dinners, but Sloane had clearly gone the extra mile. He'd had his best plates and cutlery put out, as opposed to merely the good silver, and Holly noticed several new pieces of art on the walls. She could almost taste the dark detection spells in the air Scrimger's bodyguards had put up, though. The minister himself was already sitting at the head of the table, with Sloane opposite him. Rufus Scrimger was tall and thin, with grey streaks running through his once tawny hair and several faded scars across his face. His robes were finely cut but relatively unadorned, and the walking stick that rested against his chair was just varnished wood without anything in the way of decoration. "Ah, Miss Potter. May I call you Holly?" he asked as Holly walked into the room, and she nodded. "Good to finally meet you in person, and in better circumstances than my predecessor," he said, gesturing to a seat one down from him. "Likewise, Minister," Holly said, taking the offered seat. "No need for that tonight. I've wanted to meet you for some time." "Did you know that?" Scrimger said, and Holly blinked. "I didn't," no, Holly said, unsure how to refer to him. Normally in this situation, she'd slide into either her very polite tone or be as sarcastic as she could without getting cursed. Neither of those seemed like winning strategies to her, and, she wondered, what did she call the minister after he asked her to call him that? Mr. Scrimger. Rufus. She was definitely not going to call him Rufus. Oh yes, for a very long time. Especially after Scrimger began, but he stopped as the seat opposite Holly was filled. She barely resisted the urge to groan as Cormac McLaggen sat down, and her brain unhelpfully reminded her that he and the minister were rather close. "Ah, my dear Cormac. Lovely to see you. I take it you're familiar with Miss Potter?" Scrimger asked, a wry smile on his face. Yeah, I am," McLaggen said, looking rather awkward. "Well, who isn't? Now, Tiberius tells me you've become rather the potions star this year." Scrimger asked him, and Holly was about to mentally tune out of the conversation when she saw how McLaggen looked even more awkward at the question. She'd never heard he was good at potions. Was a lie of his coming unraveled, or just natural talent showing itself, I suppose. "Now we've got rid of Snape," he said, shrugging. "Come now, Cormac. We're amongst friends here, surely there's more to it than that. Has old Horace been slipping you a tip or two?" Scrimger said, a conspiratorial grin on his face. McLaggen looked at Holly for a moment, but she was busy pretending to be annoyed with Blaise Zabinai. She was annoyed at what he'd just said, but listening into Cormac's conversation with the minister was far more interesting. As Cormac leant in to whisper something to the minister, Holly felt her wand in her pocket and subtly cast a supersensory charm, letting her pick out the whisper over the general buzz of dinner conversation. "Between you and me, he did slip me a special copy of the textbook. Annotated by some weird bloke, but his stuff works," McLaggen whispered, and Holly cancelled the charm. Making small talk with Cormac McLaggen and the Minister for Magic was not Holly's idea of a pleasant evening, but she managed. She did have to bite back enough sarcastic remarks to give Snape a heart attack, but she managed. By the time the evening was winding down, Holly was beginning to wonder if Scrimger really has just come to meet some promising young wizards, rather than anything nefarious. "Ah, Miss Potter. Why don't you walk the minister back to his carriage?" Sloane asked her. There it was. Sure, Professor Holly said, and she followed Scrimger out of the room. The tourists that had been waiting outside the door followed them, but from a distance. Dumbledore has been rather persistent in keeping me from you, you know, Scrimger said, and for the first time Holly noticed that despite his slight limp, Scrimger had a grace about him. She'd known he'd been an error, but now she was sure he'd be far more capable in a fight than Fudge. Not that the Minister for Magic should be personally dueling Death Eaters. He has. Oh yes. He's rather protective of you, not that he shouldn't be, I suppose. You have gathered that I did not come here merely for Horace's company. Though, if I weren't Minister, Scrimger asked her. I'm surprised you waited this long, Holly replied. Quite. I shan't bore you with the specifics, but I've come across something of a legal problem with regards to the security of the school. There are places the Ministry cannot search without the consent of the headmaster, due to the bylaws dating back. Well, suffice it to say that if a student was plotting something, we would be unlikely to hear about it. Minister, I doubt I could get Dumbledore to change his mind, he's rather stubborn about this sort of thing, Holly replied carefully. Ah, yes. No, that's not what I wanted to ask you. I'm going to appoint someone in the coming weeks to keep a watch on Hogwarts. Make sure things are as they should. She will need assistance from dedicated, reliable students. People who can go into the dormitories and common rooms without the permission of the headmaster. People who can blend in with the students. I'd like you to lead this group, Miss Potter, Scrimger said, and Holly tried to maintain her composure. I'm afraid I can't help you, Minister, she said, trying not to let how much she was disturbed by the idea show. A part of her also wondered what the Minister was thinking, asking her to turn against Dumbledore like this. Surely, she thought, he couldn't expect to win her over in a single conversation. Can't, Miss Potter, or won't. Scrimger said, his voice much less warm. I already have a lot of extracurricular activities, Minister. I could recommend you some, Holly began, not that she really expected him to believe her. There's no need to spin me a story. I can see that you're as much Dumbledore's woman as ever, and perhaps you have good reason to be. But I had to make the offer. You have done much for the wizarding world, and have earned at least that courtesy. When my Inquisitor arrives, do try and stay out of her way, Miss Potter, Scrimger said. Surely you have better things to do than fighting Dumbledore over this, Minister. Or have the multiple Voldemorts running around slipped your mind? There are many threats that assail this nation from within and without, Miss Potter. Some of them are kind enough to march beneath banners and dress in skull masks. Some of them are more insidious, Scrimger replied, leaning on his cane. They had reached the grounds now, and the Minister cut an eerie figure in the moonlight, his black cloak fluttering in the breeze. And you think Dumbledore is, what, secretly planning to use the ICW to coup you? Minister, if he wanted your job he'd have stood for election, Holly said. If he wished to be elected minister, I am sure he would have. But his political ambitions were never that ordinary. Perhaps you should look into what they once were, and you might understand why I do not wish for him to bring foreign wizards that would be, in effect, under his command into Britain. Good night, Miss Potter, Scrimger said, turning away from her and walking across the dark grounds towards his carriage. His two bodyguards followed him, with the team of hit wizards that had flown in with him waiting by the carriage on their brooms. Holly headed straight to Dumbledore's office, not even bothering to go back to the party. It took her some time to make it back to the castle, and before she got there she saw the minister's carriage fly over the ward line. The ride up the moving staircases was almost agony. She wanted desperately to transform and take flight, but there were too many people still around for that. People walking back from the Great Hall, teachers, the new ministry security, all of whom she did not want to see her transform into her animagus form. Ice Mice, she said to the gargoyle outside of Dumbledore's office and ran up the spiral staircase. When she opened the door to his office, however, Holly was surprised to see not the headmaster, but Professor McGonagall. Professor. I need to speak to the headmaster right away, she said. I'm afraid that will be impossible, Miss Potter. Professor Dumbledore has been called away to an urgent session of the Wizengamot. By now they are surely in session, McGonagall said, and Holly felt a jolt of panic run through her. Perhaps Scrimger had felt secure in telling her his plans because he'd already put them into motion. If he'd apparated back to the ministry, he could have made it to the Wizengamot before Holly could warn Dumbledore. Holly said a few rather rude words, which McGonagall pretended not to hear, and paced around the office. Scrimger, it was becoming clear to her, was not Fudge. He might be willing to play to the press, but he was effective. I imagine they will be long into the night. Best you head to bed, Miss Potter. Whatever scheme the minister has, there is nothing more you can do about it tonight, McGonagall said. You're probably right, Professor Holly said with a tired sigh. At once all her energy seemed to rush out of her, leaving her feeling drained and tired. She walked back to Gryffindor Tower almost in a daze, lacking even a silver of the urgency she'd had on the way to Dumbledore's office. She could hear the whispers around her now, blending into half-heard snippets of conversation and distant sounds. Hiding in the half-understood words, like something on the edge of her vision. They faded into footsteps and shouted names whenever she was actually listening, but she knew that if she really opened herself up to them, they would be waiting. Holly felt something else, too, a gnawing sense of unease whenever she thought back to the minister's parting words. What could be so bad to inspire a reaction like that in Rufus Scrimger? He was no Fudge. The man was a veteran who had cut his teeth in the war against Grindelwald, and made his name fighting Voldemort. She knew what Dumbledore wanted, didn't she? She was moving in murky waters, now, Holly knew. She was certain she had stumbled onto some old grudge, some dispute from before she was born, and it seemed like she'd chosen a side. Scrimger, the way he talked about Dumbledore, Holly didn't think it was as coolly objective as either of them pretended it was. There was something there, something deeply personal, and all Holly had to do to get answers was dig it all up again. Her wand was warm in her hand as she ascended the girls' staircase, the faint sound of Phoenix Song drawing out anything else lurking in her mind. Chapter 92, Year 5, Chapter 19. Chapter Text. Dumbledore defeated, are his days as Chief Warlock numbered? In a shock marathon session of the Wizengamot, the new Minister for Magic, Rufus Scrimger, bypassed the Chief Warlock to pass a number of new pieces of legislation. The minister also suggested, fairly, in the view of this paper, that Dumbledore can no longer hold so many conflicting positions. With an electoral mandate to refuse ICW subversion and influence, the continued appointment of Dumbledore as both Supreme Mugwump and Chief Warlock is clearly no longer the wishes of the wizarding public. Minister Scrimger's bold new moves towards security involve funding for enhanced trace networks, expanded hit wizard numbers, and further security measures at Hogwarts School. These include the appointment of a High Inquisitor to oversee security and guard against political subversion at the acclaimed school. Minister Scrimger confirmed to this paper that a candidate had been selected and was to be announced in the coming days. Our sources, speaking on condition of anonymity, say that Scrimger believes he has the numbers in the Wizengamot to unseat Dumbledore. Several esteemed members of that body have confided in this reporter that they too believe that to be the case. It seems as if the venerable Chief Warlock's days are numbered, and perhaps not a moment too soon. Dumbledore is certainly a man worthy of respect, but the aging headmaster can clearly no longer fully fulfill all of his many duties. Rita Skeeter. Holly put the copy of the Daily Prophet down in disgust the morning after Scrimger's visit. Scrimger's campaign of xenophobia had worked far too well, probably, she thought, because it let wizards blame someone else for Voldemort. It had won the minister the election, and Holly found herself wondering how much he himself believed it. This is bad. If the ministry can interfere even more at Hogwarts, Hermione said, putting her own copy of the paper down. I can't believe I'm missing Fudge, Ron said. I'm not so sure about that. At least Scrimger isn't in denial about Voldemort, Holly said, but it was a grim morning all the same. Despite it being a Saturday, even Hermione had a huge pile of homework to do as their teachers had tried to impress on them the seriousness of their OWL year by burning them in homework. Holly and Ron found a table in the library, as Hermione went to find an obscure runic reference, and they were soon joined by Ginny. She smiled at her girlfriend and flipped open her Transfiguration textbook. Hey, do you reckon you could help me out with Ron started to ask Holly, but she groaned and put her face in her hands. Well, all right then, Ron said, sounding rather offended. It's not you, Ron. I just remembered I have to go plan more lessons with Snape in about 10 minutes, Holly said. She was sure his defrosting towards her would not extend to excusing lateness. Ah, well, better you than me, mate, Ron said. Holly hugged Ginny, charmed all of her things back into her bag with a wave of her wand, and took off running for the defense classroom. Snape was waiting for her there, a mass of parchment spread across his desk. "I see your punctuality has not improved, Miss Potter," Snape said. "I see you're still not a morning person, Sir," Holly said. After Honor had been satisfied with the exchange of barbs, they got down to the business of planning more sessions of the dueling club. So far, they'd mostly focused on individual basics, shielding, stunning spells, and basic hexes and jinxes to incapacitate. This week, they'd be doing drills on avoiding spells in more realistic conditions. The traditional wizard's duel at 10 paces was fought almost solely with the fence of hex and shield. At such a close range, without cover or concealment, avoiding spells was almost impossible. It could be done. A desperate maneuver might let a witch avoid one spell, or if you had advanced knowledge of what was being cast via legilimency or certain advanced divination techniques. Even amongst wizards and witches skilled with shield charms, such duels almost never lasted longer than a minute. When the range was opened, the field was no longer a flat, narrow plane. Then, dodging or avoiding spells was possible. Holly and Snape planned their first outdoor session of the dueling club to demonstrate this, and the two of them spent much of the afternoon conjuring obstacles and etching smoke-making runes into the ground. Holly was no expert at runes, which were used in most permanent enhancements, but she'd picked up enough to copy a simple design off parchment and set it. Without being carved into something harder than the ground like wood or stone, and especially without that material being magical, the runes would only last a day or so. "Shouldn't we make this a little more permanent?" "I don't think either of us wants to spend more weekends setting up obstacle courses," Holly asked. She had been getting along better with Snape when they were working together, certainly more than she had in her first 2 years at Hogwarts, or the period of time when he'd just completely ignored her, but she still didn't want to spend her Saturday with him. "I have already asked the elves to gather the necessary materials, Potter. Alas, the building crew is booked out for several weeks, so for now we will make do," Snape said. "There's an elf building crew?" Holly asked, blinking in surprise. "Who did you think repaired all the damage your escapades caused, Potter?" Snape responded, before going back to conjuring obstacles. The next day, the dueling club met not in the Great Hall, but outside near the obstacle course Holly and Snape had prepared. It was situated on a flat portion of the ground, and had a large number of ruined-looking buildings and bits of debris scattered about. There were a number of positions marked out with paint, each of which had a view of some part of the course. "You should all, by now, be proficient with the basic elements of dueling, shielding, basic hexes, and short-range accuracy. Today, we will begin to simulate more realistic conditions. Ravenclaws, take up one of the marked positions. You will fire marking jinxes at any student you see. The rest of you will attempt to run the obstacle course without being hit," Snape said. "No shields today, we'll do a more all-up exercise later, but for today we're just working on not being hit," Holly said, and then she took the Ravenclaws aside and started to distribute them around the course. Each house got a turn firing off jinxes and 3 runs at the obstacle course. By the end of the meeting, everybody was hit at least a few times and some people were covered in glowing marks from head to toe. But it was far less than they would have been trying to dodge at their previous 10 paces. After that, Holly and Snape supervised several duels in the arena they'd built, one-on-one, for the moment. According to the curriculum they'd written, team exercises were due to start next term. Holly felt a little uneasy at leaving them that long, because working as a group was probably the most effective way to keep her fellow students safe. If the new Ministry Inquisitor didn't come down on the dueling club, which was fairly transparently just wartime defense, Holly wanted to do the most important parts first. So far, though, Scrimgeour hadn't tried to move against her, only Dumbledore. The Ministry and the Prophet, though those were essentially one and the same, were still singing her praises. She'd read a recent article about her suggesting an Order of Merlin above first class be created just for her, which seemed very silly to her. At least nobody at Prophet had heard any rumors about the prophecy yet, though Holly was dreading when something about it inevitably leaked. There was an atmosphere of unease throughout the school for the next week, with rumors about the new High Inquisitor spreading fast. Some people were saying that she was going to be an Auror, here to root out secret Death Eaters amongst the students. One particularly credulous third year suggested that it would be Amelia Bones, before being reminded that she was still head of the DMLE and thus rather busy with two Dark Lords running about. Nobody knew anything for sure, however, even Dumbledore, when Holly asked him about it during their by now regular weekend lesson. "So you don't know who this Inquisitor will be?" Holly asked him. They were walking on the grounds, rather than in his office, so she was sure the lesson was going to be a practical one. "Scrimger is, as they say, playing this one close to his chest. I suspect, based on what he told you, that she will be a ministry bureaucrat rather than an Auror or another member of the DMLE. As morally bankrupt as I find his actions, Scrimger is no fool. He is looking to exert control over Hogwarts, not to catch junior Death Eaters," Dumbledore explained. "That makes sense, I guess. Can I help, sir?" "You know, with the Wizengamot?" Holly asked. There was a brisk breeze, but the night was only bracing rather than truly uncomfortable. "I suspect you could delay Scrimger a good 6 months, my dear girl, but that would be 6 months ill-bought. If the Ministry is hostile to you, Voldemort will surely find a way to turn that to his advantage. If we could prevail, I would have had you in that chamber months ago." Alas, that was not to be, Dumbledore said, and Holly could hear his age in his voice more than she ever had. She wondered sometimes what Dumbledore had been like when he was young. The minister had said he'd been very different, dangerous, even, and she knew he'd defeated Gellert Grindelwald at the end of the Second World War. Beyond that, she knew very little of Dumbledore's origins. Had he once had a family? Did he still have brothers, sisters? What had he been involved in that had so spooked the minister? "I believe we're far enough away from the castle for now," Dumbledore said, snapping Holly out of her musings. "What are we learning, Professor?" Holly asked. Her wand was warm in her hand, though not uncomfortably so. "A speciality of mine, conjuration and animation. When he failed to kill you as a baby, Voldemort marked you as his equal. He gave you exactly the powers he had on that fateful Halloween night. He has undoubtedly learned much, especially of the more esoteric forms of magic, in the time since, but I suspect that by the time you have finished school, you would be his equal on the field of battle," Dumbledore said. Professor, the powers he gave me. I'm scared of them," Holly said, quietly. She felt very small, the warmth of her wand disappearing in the cold wind. Dumbledore didn't respond for a moment, but his expression contained no judgment. She heard the whispers now, a roar rising from almost nothing. A roar rising from sound hidden in the wind and half-heard conversations. She tried to ignore the words because now she could understand them. "In the graveyard, casting the killing curse was easy. It's like that whenever I listen to them. And every time I do, I can remember how to do it afterwards," Holly continued. "No matter what powers Voldemort may have passed on to you, Holly, you are not him. Once before, I told you that it is not our abilities that define us but our actions, and your actions are as different from Voldemort's as they were then. Whatever he left behind, you have proven yourself to be selfless, to be merciful, to be kind. Things Voldemort never was," Dumbledore said, gently placing a hand on Holly's shoulder. "What if I'm not anymore? What if I'm slowly becoming more and more like him?" Holly asked. "We are not defined solely by nature. Even if you were to possess some of his personality, Holly, you would still be able to choose. You have known things he never has, love, kindness, true friendship. Things far stronger than some powers left behind by a dark wizard," Dumbledore said, and Holly could breathe again. There was only the quiet of the wind and gently swaying trees. Thank you, sir. Now, about those conjurations," Holly said. Yes. An art Voldemort was never all that fond of, and, I think, one of his great weaknesses. You have already practiced controlling water to shield yourself, and I think you show great talent for this. Now, let us move from elementary substances to conjured creatures," Dumbledore began, and Holly could see the genuine smile on his face as he taught her the advanced transfiguration. It was entirely unlike the magic the whispers gave her, a thing of creation and beauty. It didn't come as easily to her, but she relished it for that. This was something she could learn, something she had done. She learned to conjure great flocks of birds with a wave of her wand and to animate them to defend her from curses. She learned how to animate statues and furniture and garden gnomes to fight for her. She was not a master in the subject in one afternoon, of course, but she could practice on her own time. Indeed, she was having so much fun animating birds to follow all sorts of instructions that she nearly forgot to go to dinner the night after her lesson with Dumbledore. Holly made it there just in time, glad to see Ron, Ginny, and Hermione had saved her a spot. Just as the food appeared and she sat down, there was a knock on the great doors. Then another. Before there could be a third, Dumbledore raised a hand and they swung open. Behind them was a witch in a violently pink outfit, escorted by the half-dozen hit wizards on duty at Hogwarts at any one time. Holly thought something about her seemed familiar. The witch strode up the great hall, her escorts marching with military precision behind her, until she had ascended the steps up to the staff table. Dumbledore looked at her, though his expression betrayed nothing. Several of the teachers seemed to have recognized the witch, and judging by their reactions Holly was growing more and more worried. Dolores. This is an unexpected pleasure. Does the bewildering and onerous records and editing department have business at Hogwarts? Dumbledore asked calmly, and Holly felt the entire hall try very hard not to laugh. I've accepted a new position, Headmaster, the witch said, and approached Dumbledore's lectern without any further words between them. Now she could get a good look at the witch's face. Holly recognized her as Umbridge, a witch who had been at the forefront of the Fudge Ministry's anti-werewolf measures. She'd heard enough from rumors to know that, despite the pink cardigan, the woman was dangerous. Hem. Hello, children. I am Dolores Umbridge, your new High Inquisitor, and I'm here to keep you all safe from the nasty Death Eaters, Umbridge began. The High Inquisitor had arrived at Hogwarts. Chapter 93, Year 5, Chapter 20. Chapter Text. You will notice, I am sure, that we have a guest here today, Snape said as the fifth-year Gryffindors filed in for their defense lesson. Dolores Umbridge lurked like an overly pink bat in the corner of the classroom, sitting in a poorly conjured pink-cushioned armchair with a clipboard in her hands. The Gryffindors, wisely, just took their seats without comment. It was Umbridge's first day on the job, but she hadn't exactly gained a legion of loyal followers with her introductory speech. Yes, thank you, Professor, Umbridge began, but her shrill voice was lost against the clutter of seats on stone. I expect you to show her the same courtesy and respect you would show me, Snape said, pretending not to have heard her. Holly felt conflicted. She still thought Snape was a complete bastard. He might be polite to her now, but he was still the same bully to everyone else. But Umbridge was really annoying. And, she noted more soberly, a real threat if the minister really had chosen her personally. Whatever else he was, Rufus Scrimger was no fool. Why, thank you, Professor, Umbridge said, sounding genuinely pleased, and Holly heard a few hastily stifled giggles all around her. And what might your lesson plan for today be, Professor Snape? Umbridge asked, a quill hovering in the air above her clipboard. Today we will be conducting a review of the shield charm and ensuring that the summer holiday has not sapped all traces of proficiency from the class, Snape said, dryly. A practical review, Snape clarified for the class. A practical review. Isn't that rather advanced for an OWL class so early in the year? Umbridge asked. My predecessor advanced many elements of the curriculum. Given the test scores his classes achieved, I see no reason to let up. Ah, yes, Moody was your predecessor. Are you sure it was wise to let a man of his temperament teach young children? Umbridge asked, her enchanted quill seeming to shiver in anticipation. I think you will find my input into the hiring of new defense professors at this school is extremely limited, High Inquisitor Snape said, as he wordlessly conjured 2 rows of cushions. Holly and her classmates knew what to do for an exercise like this by now, and so they lined up in 2 rows facing one another. The first marking jinxes were splashing off domes of light before Snape turned around. No marking jinxes today. All that will prove is that you can conjure a shield, something I'm sure even the most dunderheaded of you has learned by now. You may cast whatever jinxes you like to bring down your partner's charm. Switch every minute, Snape said, and he tapped his wand against a small sand glass. It floated up into the air, and let out a ringing sound as the sand filled it and it flipped over. This looks to be a very advanced exercise, Professor. What if one of the students is jinxed? Umbridge asked. Then they will be motivated to perfect their shield charms, Snape replied blithely, as Dean Thomas hit Lavender Brown with a pumpkinhead jinx. She squealed and fell over, but the cushion gave her a soft landing. Dean vanished the pumpkin, and Lavender was trying hard not to laugh whilst spitting bits of raw pumpkin from her mouth. The lesson continued on in that fashion until the end, with Umbridge asking Snape endless questions and jotting things down on her clipboard, which seemed enchanted to spit out more parchment whenever she filled it up. Holly wasn't sure if Snape had passed or failed the High Inquisitor's inspection, and as she went to follow her friends to their next lesson, herbology, she was surprised to find she hoped he had. Ah, that Umbridge. I can't believe she made me take Snape's side in something. Snape. Ron said as they walked down to the greenhouses across the grounds. She is rather horrid, isn't she? Hermione said, taking her dragon hide gloves out of her bag as they approached the greenhouse they'd be using for the day's herbology lesson. Oh, did you have that ministry lady inspecting your defense lesson? Hannah Abbott asked. The red-headed girl was already waiting outside the greenhouse, chatting away with her friends. She's awful, but it was pretty entertaining to watch, Holly said. I'd imagine, Snape being mean to someone who deserves it for once. Hannah replied. Almost everyone had arrived by then, and Holly was starting to wonder where Professor Sprout was. The head of Hufflepuff House was never late, especially not when her students would be working in one of the more dangerous greenhouses. Just as Holly was beginning to worry, she spotted the professor making her way down from the castle towards the greenhouse. Even as she started to relax, though, she saw something in the professor's face, in the way she stood, and a chill ran down her spine. Miss Abbott. Professor Sprout said, and her voice lacked all of its usual excitement. It wasn't harsh or cold, but perhaps even worse, it was warm and kind. Hannah blinked and turned toward the professor. The two of them walked some distance away, out of casual earshot, but not far enough away to conceal Hannah's racking, awful sobs. When Professor Sprout returned, perhaps 10 minutes later, nobody said much of anything. There were whispers, of course, but even those were muted and perfunctory. Hannah wasn't at dinner that night, nor breakfast the next morning. The post owls brought an explanation with their ever more grisly morning newspapers. Hannah's mother had been found dead, and her home burned to the ground. A photo of the still burning building, dark mark and all, led the story on the Prophet's third page. It was the morning of the first Quidditch game of the year, Gryffindor vs Slytherin, and nobody seemed to be particularly cheerful. Holly hadn't known Hannah Abbott all that well, but like most of the school, she'd known her as a pleasant, cheerful girl. Hufflepuff House seemed to deflate as a whole, and she couldn't help but be reminded of Cedric's death. Holly almost raced into the changing rooms, eager to leave her problems behind in the air, if only for a short while. As she and the rest of the Gryffindor team lined up on the pitch, she felt how the wind had turned cold, how the bitter autumn breeze had become almost a gale. She felt herself fade into it, letting the howl of the wind wash away everything else. Then she was in the air, and there was only the players and the balls and the wind. Nothing else in the universe seemed to exist when she was flying, and she zoomed through the match, avoiding a concentrated attack by the Slytherin beaters with daring aerial acrobatics and frantic speed. At one point, she only barely managed to lean out of the way of a bludger that went rocketing past her head, even as Angelina put another goal through the hoops. Then she felt something crash into her from behind, slamming into her with enough force to rip her broom from her hands. She fell, reaching for her wand with desperate haste and preparing to transform into her animagus form. Secrecy be damned, but then someone grabbed her and leveled out. Ginny had caught her, and her girlfriend pulled Holly up onto her broom and hugged her. Merlin, Holly, are you all right? Ginny asked, as Angelina flew over with Holly's firebolt. Madam Hooch was blowing her whistle madly. I think so. What happened? She asked, extremely conscious of just how close she was to Ginny and just how public the situation was. Goyle crashed into you. Bloody maniac, Ginny said. Madam Hooch seemed to have abandoned her whistle for screaming extremely loudly and waving her wand about. Angelina handed Holly her broom, and after she assured Angelina she was all right, Holly kissed Ginny lightly on the lips and leapt back onto her firebolt. Thanks for catching me, Holly said, a faint red blush on her cheeks. Anytime, Ginny said, and then the game was back on. Holly dived back into the fray, making sure to keep her eyes on the Slytherin beaters as well as their bludgers. She had a few more near misses, having to duck a blatant strike by Goyle towards her head with his bat once or twice, but she escaped any further injury. All the effort keeping herself from being flattened took was making it hard for her to focus on the snitch, and so the new Slytherin seeker, a boy of strictly limited intelligence named Harper, actually managed to spot the snitch first. Rather than try and get subtly into position as a better seeker might have before starting the chase, he rocketed after it on his brand new Nimbus. Holly saw him move out of the corner of her eye and was at her broom's maximum acceleration before she had even consciously registered what was going on. Her better broom and tolerance for acceleration let her catch up to Harper, but the snitch dived down into the wood-covered trench around the pitch. The two seekers dived after it at irresponsible speeds, but here in the tight confines of the large wooden trench neither could use the full acceleration of their brooms. With Holly's advantage in acceleration useless, Harper's Nimbus 2100 was actually at an advantage, the more nimble broom being better suited for the restricted conditions. Holly rolled madly to avoid a wooden spar, just as Harper struck out at her with his leg. She dodged and returned the favor, slamming her shoulder into his ribs and cutting in front of him. Then they had to split apart as the trench narrowed, and Holly felt her plan click into place in her mind. She was neck and neck with Harper as the snitch started another mad circuit of the trench, and Holly felt herself sink into what was almost a trance. She felt no fear, despite zooming around at 100 miles an hour in a confined space. She just knew what she was going to do, and her hands were as steady as a statue's as she felt the narrowest point of the trench approach. Harper tried to kick her again, and Holly accelerated madly. She trusted in her intuitive sense of the wind and of direction to guide her to the point she knew the snitch must be and that Harper couldn't follow her through. He tried, and only managed to avoid slamming into a wooden spar at the very last moment, and he was forced to turn sharply up and out of the trench as Holly's fist closed around the snitch. Holly rolled up and away from the trench madly, feeling the force of it slam into her and clutching desperately with her legs to stay on her broom. She decelerated as hard as she could, barely a meter or two above the grass of the pitch, hanging sideways onto her broom so she didn't hit the ground, and came to a stop in the center of the pitch. She lifted up the snitch in one hand, and her broom in the other. The crowd roared, and her teammates flocked to her as the scoreboard showed a crushing victory for Gryffindor. Ginny hugged her hard enough to almost knock her over, and Angelina looked like she was about to burst into tears. "Now that's how you chase down a snitch," Fred shouted, pumping his bat into the air. "Bloody hell, mate, I thought you were gonna smash into something down there," Ron said, and Holly grinned. She looked around, drinking in the despair on the faces of the Slytherin team. She never liked seeing the expressions of defeat and misery they wore on her Quidditch opponents' faces, but the Slytherin house team were a special exception. Especially after they had blatantly cheated to try and knock her out of the match. Only, as she felt the euphoria of her victory rush through her, Holly thought there was something missing. She turned towards Harper, the new Slytherin seeker, and it hit her like a punch to the head. She had been expecting to see Malfoy there, to hear him mutter something about next time, Potter. She'd hated the GIT, and yet she felt something awful and cold run through her when she remembered what had happened to him. When she saw him gone from the place he should have been. Suddenly, the victory felt bittersweet. She would never again return to the days before the tournament before Voldemort returned. She would never face Draco or Cedric on the Quidditch pitch ever again, and she felt suddenly all too old. "You all right?" Ginny asked her quietly, as the crowd kept roaring. "I'm fine. Just thinking about how things have changed," Holly said, feeling the warmth of her phoenix feather wand against her skin. Chapter 94, Year 5, Chapter 21. Chapter Text. The rain beat down on Hogwarts with a steady rhythm, and the sky outside was unseasonably dark even for the beginning of October. Holly thought she could feel something in the air, a strange sense of aliveness, and then she saw a distant flash of light and, a few seconds later, the rumble of thunder. "Weather's looking good for Hogsmeade then," Ron said, as the third years and above gathered in the entrance hall on the first Hogsmeade weekend of the term. "I just love being rained on when I'm on a date," Ginny said, rolling her eyes. "For us unattached, loveless failures, being rained on is much better," Ron replied. "Do you want me to charm your cloak or not, Ronald?" Hermione asked, and Ron went a little red. "Ah, yeah, that'd be nice." "Thanks, Hermione," Ron said. "You know the imperturbable charm isn't that hard to learn, and it's on the charms Newt," Hermione continued. "Newt level charm and not that hard are things that only go together for you, Hermione." Honestly, Ron, Holly knows it. Hermione said, gesturing towards Holly, who was charming her and Ginny's cloaks against the downpour. Well, she's not like the rest of us, is she? No offense mate, but you didn't exactly. Ron began until Ginny elbowed him and he realized she was in public. Do you just have no filter between your mouth and your brain? Ginny asked. I'm sorry, mate. Wasn't thinking, Ron said, sheepishly. It's fine. Let's just get going. It's probably only going to get worse if we wait any longer, Holly said, gesturing towards the dark sky and pouring rain. Ron had been careless, she knew, but she couldn't exactly hold that against him. She had nearly gotten her only Muggle friends killed out of her own carelessness at the start of the year. More than careless, he had been right. The powers Voldemort had left behind on the Halloween night he failed to kill her hadn't been just the ability to talk to snakes. After Ron and Hermione had been petrified in their second year, Holly had been able to call on something when she learned magic. It seemed to flow far easier to her, and it had been getting easier. When she was in danger, when she was desperate, she could sink completely into the whispers and cast spells she had never learned. She had first done that to cast a dark curse that had cut Peter Pettigrew's arm off at the shoot, and only not killed him because she'd missed. The incantation in Parseltongue was burned into her mind, and she could cast the spell as easily as any she had learned. Then, a year later, the whispers had taught her how to cast the killing curse. How to channel all her hate and anger into magic, how to hurl it out into the world. Holly shivered, despite the roaring fires in the entrance hall's many fireplaces. She heard things, sometimes. She heard the whispers in the crackling of a roaring fire or the rushing water of a shower. I do hope you're not doing magic outside of class, Granger Cormac McLaggen said, and Holly blinked. McLaggen, thankfully, wasn't a prefect. Even most prefects wouldn't bother reprimanding someone for spelling their cloak against rain. Why do you care? It's not like you're in the running for head boy, McLaggen, Holly said as she turned around. Her eyes narrowed as she saw a large gold badge on his robes, that looked similar to a prefect's from a distance, but instead of a large P, it bore a stylized I with an I behind it. I care, Potter, because someone recognized that I have been unfairly excluded from leadership positions. I care, Potter, because as of this morning and as of Educational Decree number 23 I am the new head of the Hogwarts Inquisitorial Squad, McLaggen said, assuming a pose he must have thought made him look important. Holly thought it mostly made him look silly. As she looked around, Holly did see other students with new badges on their robes, though theirs were silver and slightly smaller than McLaggen's. She didn't recognize every member, but everyone she did recognize was either a well-connected pureblood, an obnoxious twit, or both. Good for you, I guess. Was this the closest your dad could get to buying you a ministry job, or were you just desperate to be a little tyrant? Holly said, knowing it was probably a bad idea but unable to stop herself. 10 points from Gryffindor for your insubordination, Potter. Now, all of you, take your wands out, McLaggen said, and Holly rolled her eyes as she held her wand out and he began to inspect the spells they had last cast. Wow, Cormac, did you come up with this one on your own? Only, what, a month or two after everyone figured out how to get around it? Holly said. Careful, Potter. I can do more than dock points or assign detentions, McLaggen said, and Holly looked him dead in the eye. I would dearly love to see you try, she said, all the mocking amusement gone from her voice. Ginny put a hand on her arm, but Holly didn't waver. Get going before I have to assign detentions, McLaggen said, his expression not nearly so confident as it had been a moment before. Students were exiting the entrance hall in small groups, 3 or 4 at a time, instead of all at once like a normal Hogsmeade weekend. The Inquisitorial Squad was checking every wand, and casting all manner of dark detection charms. Holly wasn't sure what they thought that would achieve. There were real hit wizards at the gates, and all manner of wards on the castle. Maybe, she thought to herself, it made them feel important. It was still pouring with rain as Holly and her friends arrived at the Three Broomsticks, and Holly was glad she'd charmed her cloak against rain. She was nice and dry, but poor Seamus Finnegan was soaked to the bone. Bloody hell, you think the founders might have picked a slightly nicer spot for their castle, Ron said as he opened the door to the pub and its welcome warmth. I guess they thought they had a better chance of being left alone up here, Holly said with a shrug as she followed Ron into the pub. She and Ginny would eat lunch in here with Ron and Hermione, before going off on their own for a bit. It wasn't really a date, but for being at a secret magical boarding school in the middle of nowhere, it was the best they could do. Or at least, the best they could do without braving the cloying perfume of Madame Puddifoot's, which neither of them was quite brave enough to attempt. "It really is quite beautiful, you know," Hermione said, her voice almost disappearing in the noise of the crowded pub. People were carrying on loud conversations, students and locals alike, and the fire was roaring in the corner. A dog barked loudly in the distance, and someone was frying something loudly in the kitchen. "Well, I suppose it is. And the flying's good," Ron admitted. "And the flying's good," Ginny echoed. "Sod off, you say that 3 times a week, Gin." "Oh, you say that 3 times a week, Gin," Ginny repeated back to Ron in a sing-song voice. "Really, Ginny?" Hermione said, and then Holly could feel the headache building up behind her ears. She tried to focus on something else in the pub, but the noise was all blurring into a wall of sound that she could barely understand, and then she could hear them here too, in the places where the sounds overlapped. Words twisted, and suddenly she smelled something else instead of roast chicken, and her food tasted like ash. "And I need to get some fresh air," Holly said as she stood up unsteadily and headed for the door. She ran outside, forgetting to take her cloak with her, but even as she felt the ice-cold rain slam into her, she didn't bother to go back. She just stood there in the middle of a deserted street, letting the rain wash over her. She could still hear them in the raindrops and the distant thunder, but as she closed her eyes and focused on the sensation of the rain hitting her skin, on the ice-cold water, they began to fade. She took deep, ragged breaths and kept her focus on just that. She felt herself calm, felt the whispers fade away. The sound of the rain was just rain. The muffled voices from inside the 3 broomsticks were just muffled voices. All she could smell was rain, the faint scent of horse manure, and wet dog. Holly opened her eyes, and for one mad moment, she thought Sirius had come to Hogsmeade unannounced. The dog in front of her was larger than his animagus form, and its eyes were a different shade of yellow. They seemed to glow, almost, in the darkness of the cloudy day. It seemed to look at her with intelligence, with purpose, and then it turned around. She knew it was stupid. She knew that if it was anything but a stray, following it would be the height of idiocy. If was anything but a stray, it was probably a transfigured construct, an attempt to mimic Sirius's form to lure her somewhere. The Grim was just a wizarding myth. But she'd seen this dog twice before. Once, during the summer before her 3rd year, at Hermione's house. Then again just before the 3rd task, when she'd been walking right next to Sirius. Right before Cedric had died. She drew her wand, taking comfort from the warmth of the phoenix feather. She could feel that whenever she touched her wand, now. Ever since the graveyard, ever since her wand had clashed against its brother, ever since she had defeated Voldemort in the strange battle of wills they had fought. The dog gave off an excited bark and began to run, and Holly rushed after it. She was fast on her feet, for her size or not, but the dog was faster, and Holly began to fall behind as she chased it down the winding, impossible streets of Hogsmeade. She looked around and grinned when she saw that nobody was watching. Mid-stride, she transformed into her animagus form and began to fly in one seamless motion. She put all the effort she could behind her wings, and for a moment seemed to be gaining on the dog. Then it was again faster than her, and so Holly called on the command of the wind her messenger raven form lent her. She flew at speeds no mundane raven, not even one with her sizable wingspan, could have matched, and the dog again became faster still. Then, with incredible agility, it turned around a sharp corner. Holly had to decelerate hard, holding out her wings and calling on the wind to stop herself from smashing into a stone wall. She turned the corner as quickly as she could, but she could see no sign of the dog. "Katie, you're really worrying me. What's in the package?" "Leave it alone, Leanne, it's nothing to do with you," Katie Bell said, as she and her friend Leanne were standing alone in the rain, arguing over a brown paper package. The rain, and 2 sets of hands tugging on it, was too much for the paper to bear, and it split in half. A necklace studded with glittering green opals spilled forth from it, and Holly's heart almost stopped. She had seen that necklace once before, at Borgin's and Burke's. She could smell the dark magic on it, see it, with her form's eyes. Screw her secret, she thought, and transformed in sight of the 2 girls. Even though she had her wand in her hand, Even though she cast without words, even though she cast with the speed of a champion duelist, it was almost too late. Holly didn't have time to cast the complex countercharm, so she jabbed her wand forward and cast a wordless blasting hex. Leanne went flying, as did the cursed pearls, but Katie floated up into the air, and Holly tried desperately not to scream. She could still see the curse taking shape, still see it lifting her friend up into the air. There was no time for complex curse breaking, no time to gently unravel the threads of magic and ill intent. There was no time for the safe, effective method. There was no time. She had been too late to save Katie. So Holly poured all her desperation, all her worry and all her memories of Katie, all the Quidditch practice, all the gentle support after she'd come out into her wand. She poured them into her magic, and she reached into the deepest part of herself. A part she had reached only once before, in the graveyard. Her eyes burned with golden light as she yelled a wordless scream, as she felt the magic burn within her. Crackling arcs of golden energy leapt from her wand, and Holly wrenched the curse away from Katie. She screamed and dropped onto the muddy ground, but now Holly could spare no attention for her, not if she wanted to live. The curse, powerful and malevolent, roared toward Holly. She saw it as a thing of black, inky smoke, and its stench of ashes and mold and death overpowered anything else, though it was invisible and smelt of nothing. Her brain could not process the magic as magic, and so it showed it to her as something it could understand. Holly hissed madly, and fire exploded from her wand. Blue for a moment, before it became the orange-white of Fiendfyre. The snake of cursed flame opened its jaws and swallowed the curse whole, destroying even the dark magic, and then it roared up and consumed the opals too for good measure. The fire turned towards Holly, straining against her will. It wanted to burn. It wanted to burn Katie, and Leanne, and Hogsmeade, and the rain and the sky, and Holly commanded it to extinguish itself, and it did. Even the mightiest serpent, even the basilisk of Slytherin, could not defy its Parseltongue master. Not if she had the will to speak the serpent tongue. Holly, Leanne said, her voice filled with equal measures of fear and amazement. Or perhaps they were one and the same. Nice to see you two here, Holly said, weakly. She didn't know what else to say. Then she felt her legs go weak, and her eyes go dark. She fell face forward into the muddy ground, and into the comforting darkness of unconsciousness. Holly, she heard a familiar voice ask, and she opened her eyes to see Ginny's face above her own. How long was I out? Holly asked. Just a few minutes, Hermione said. You almost gave us a heart attack, running out into the rain like that. Guess you had a good reason though, Ron said. Katie? Holly asked, the fear that she might have been too late after all rushing through her. I'm all right, Holly. I don't remember what happened after I went into the ladies' room at the Three Broomsticks, Katie said, and Holly felt her strength return to her legs. Ginny helped her up and handed Holly her wand. She must also have cast a cleaning charm to get off most of the mud while Holly was unconscious. Imperious. Some evil bastard cursed you and tried to use you to kill someone, Holly said, her mind racing despite her pounding headache. Merlin, Ron began, but he was interrupted by the pounding boots of the Magical Law Enforcement Patrol. They rushed into the alleyway with their wands in their hands, a good half-dozen of the ordinary wizard policemen. What's going on here? All our dark detectors just went mad, the patrol wizard who seemed to be in charge asked Holly. Bloody late as usual, Ginny muttered under her breath. Someone used the Imperious Curse to try and get Katie to deliver a cursed object to someone. Leanne was trying to reason with her, and the packaging broke, Holly explained. Merlin's beard, a curse that powerful, the patrol wizard said, looking at Holly with awe. I managed to break it, but, I didn't have time to do it properly, Holly said, trying not to think about what the smell of brimstone in the alleyway reminded her of. We need to secure the... Destroyed it, too. It was still active, Holly said. She thought it was probably best not to tell them where she'd seen it before, lest they be tempted to ask any questions about why the alleyway smelt of brimstone. Is there anything else you need, Miss Potter? The patrolman asked. An escort to the castle's infirmary, Hermione said, firmly, and Holly smiled. That, she thought, she could definitely use. Chapter 95, Year 5, Chapter 22. Chapter text. Holly spent the night in the hostel wing, Madame Pomfrey promptly feeding her a measure of dreamless sleep potion after Holly had finished giving her statement to the Urras. Nobody seemed to have any idea who had cursed Katie, and of course, the return wand checks by the Inquisitorial squad had achieved nothing. She was, Holly thought to herself, way too familiar with the school's infirmary. Just her Quidditch injuries alone had put her in here more often than any normal student, and then there were all the adventures. She'd recovered from all manner of bizarre and awful injuries in her, from having all the bones in her left arm vanished to the aftermath of the graveyard. Miss Bell was extraordinarily lucky that you just so happened to arrive right in time, Dumbledore said, as he sat down on a chair across from Holly's bed. It was early in the morning, though the full light of day was streaming in through the hospital wing's large windows. Yeah. I guess someone has to have all the good luck we've been missing, Sir, Holly said, nervously. She had told no one about seeing the Grim, about how it had led her to Katie. She was sure that anyone who heard her story would call her mad. Perhaps you share the gift of prophecy along with your friend Ronald. In any matter, your suspicions as to the providence of the object were correct. It was indeed a cursed necklace sold by Borgin and Burkes, though of course, Mr. Borgin has no knowledge of who may have purchased it. A powerful artifact, though one mainly used for muggle baiting, Dumbledore said, dropping the topic of Holly's timely arrival with a knowing look. She hated it when he did that. Sir, do you know who she was supposed to hand it to? Holly asked, quietly. From what I could examine of the remains of the packaging and Miss Bell's memories, I do. You were the intended target, Dumbledore said quietly, and Holly felt her blood go cold. Someone had nearly killed Katie in some half-baked attempt to kill her. It was awful to think about. Not that Holly didn't think that there would be people plotting to kill her, but the assassin has to be a student, don't they? Or someone else unskilled in the dark arts, yes. Only someone without the skill to cast a curse of their own would be forced to resort to buying such an imprecise tool. Voldemort would know that you would not be taken in by such an object, and no Death Eater would dare attempt to preempt him in such a manner, Dumbledore said. Holly didn't say anything, after that. Her mind conjured an image of Avery, an older boy who had tried to kill her last year after she had killed his father during the attack on the Quidditch World Cup. She remembered ordering his father's fiend fear back on him, the way he had. Ah, forgive me, my dear. I do believe I have rather brought down the tone of my visit from the one I intended, Dumbledore said, and Holly blinked. Brought down the tone, sir? Multiple people almost died. Holly asked, confused. A matter which I have already discussed extensively with the Urras assigned to the case. I had been meaning to ask to see you on this matter before the tragic events of yesterday, Dumbledore said. Ah, about what, Professor? I did once say that I would look into a more complete solution to the problem of your body than the potions Madame Pomfrey is able to prescribe, as such permanent changes to the human body are the domain of alchemy. A subject which, with all possible modesty, I consider myself to something of an expert in, Dumbledore said, and Holly felt like crying. After years of no news, and her own studies into alchemy, ritual magic, and the like in search of a solution without any leads, she had all but given up hope. Have you found one? Holly asked, her voice quiet and soft and very small. I believe I have, though I believe it would be more proper to say that I invented one. What few historical records of such alchemy exist predate many of the requisite advances, so I suspect that there is a simpler, more elegant solution that I could not recreate, Dumbledore said, and then Holly did cry. It really works, though. It does. But it is not a spell I or Madame Pomfrey can perform for you. Like a Patronus charm, it requires specific intent and emotion, and a small quantity of blood. To balance the arithmancy, it also requires you to be at least 17 years of age, Dumbledore said, and it seemed like a cruel dashing of her hopes. But, Holly knew, Dumbledore was almost certainly right about that. 17 as the age of majority in the magical world had some arithmetic and numerological basis. Less than 2 years, she told herself. Less than 2 years. I understand, Holly said, her voice thick with tears. Dumbledore stood, and laid a large scroll of parchment on her bedside table. I believe your friends would like to see you now, if that is acceptable to you. Dumbledore said, and Holly nodded. She clutched the scroll to her chest, unwilling to believe it was real. As Dumbledore left, Ron, Hermione, and Ginny all rushed into the hospital wing, and Holly couldn't blink away her tears in time. Are you all right, Holly?" Hermione asked. Holly couldn't muster a coherent answer, so she just handed the scroll to Hermione and smiled madly. Hermione took it, then let out a noise of understanding when she began to read it. "That's wonderful, Holly," Hermione said. Ron flushed a bright red when he understood what the scroll is about, but he gave Holly an awkward sort of smile and she couldn't help smiling back. Ginny just hugged her. "I'm so happy for you," Ginny said, and even though someone was trying to kill her and the country was falling apart, Holly's life was good, if only for one Sunday morning. Life had to continue on at Hogwarts, even though a pall had seemed to settle over the school. The war, and people were starting to call it that now, was encroaching more and more on the isolation of Hogwarts. The rumor that a student had been behind the attack on Katie spread throughout the school like wildfire, and the Inquisitorial Squad seemed determined to catch the culprit. There were more and more wand checks, and several times the Inquisitorial Squad went all over the dormitories with dark detectors and other magical devices, but all they found were a few minor artifacts, biting snack boxes, vanishing keys, and the like. A few students got detention, but no deadly curses or books on the dark arts were turned up, though anyone who had something like could probably hide it so that Umbridge Scoons couldn't find it. Holly's own small, handwritten notebook was full of curses and obscure lore that she wouldn't want to explain to the High Inquisitor, but it was also just a notebook charmed against spills and the like. She had a half-dozen more like it, and as she'd never felt the need to make it curse some specific kind of person like most books on the dark arts, it was undetectable by any dark detector. Dueling Club for the week had been cancelled due to Holly's injury, but she felt uneasy when she looked over its syllabus. She and Snape had planned to accelerate it a bit, but if the Ministry were cracking down this hard. "And what is your concern, Miss Potter?" Snape asked her after the first potions lesson that week. "The Ministry is interfering at Hogwarts, and it's because the Minister doesn't trust Dumbledore. He was really spooked by Dumbledore in command of an ICW mission against Voldemort," Holly said, quietly. Snape had cast some kind of charm to prevent overhearing. She hadn't heard the incantation, but she could probably reverse engineer it from knowing the wand movement and feeling the magic being cast. She might have to get Hermione to help her with that. She was a much better arithmancer than Holly. "Yes, I'm well aware that our esteemed minister is a paranoid fool, Potter. Well, I just don't think we can plan on getting a full school year. At least officially," Holly said. "At least officially. I assure you, Miss Potter, that if it were to be banned, you couldn't hold a dueling club without official sanction," Snape said. "Maybe not at scale. But I've been thinking about it, and if we had somewhere secret to practice, I think I could probably manage it. I was planning on using the Chamber of Secrets, now that the basilisk is dead. I just wanted to know if you had a better idea," Holly said, shrugging, and Snape's eyes narrowed as he considered the idea. "I will ask Albus if he is aware of less complicated locations," Snape said. Which, Holly thought, was probably about as close to acknowledging that she'd had a good idea as Snape would ever come. "Well, that's all then, Professor. Have a good afternoon," Holly said, and was surprised to find that she meant it. That evening, as she and her friends were studying in the common room, Holly laid out a sheet of parchment in front of Hermione. "What's this, Holly?" she asked. "A spell to stop people eavesdropping on you. I saw Snape use it, and since everybody doesn't use it," Holly said, grinning. "Then it must be something he invented. Or a secret order spell, or something," Hermione said excitedly. "Exactly. Although they taught me the Patronus message spell, so I don't think it's an order spell. Will you help me figure it out, Hermione?" Holly asked, and Hermione smiled. "Of course, it sounds like an ever so exciting project," she said, and turned towards the parchment. It had Holly's notes on the wand movement, slight sound, and feeling of the spell. The wand movement and incantation of the spell were related, though they would only be able to guess the rhythm and length of the incantation from the wand movement. Hermione hauled some massive books of reference tables down from her dormitory, and the two of them worked until the fire had gone down, lost in the excitement of reverse engineering one of Snape's own spells, but in the end, they cracked it. They had a host of potential incantations, but the one Snape had chosen would be sealed in by regular use, and so they were able to run down a list of names they'd come up with until it worked. Muffliato. Holly said, and the same sensation of a slight buzzing noise filled her ears. I think it worked, she said to Hermione, through the tiredness they were both feeling. Hermione yawned and got up. Then, as Holly started to say numbers one after the other, she took steps backward until she could hear only the buzzing sound. The spell was working. Holly was bleary-eyed and tired the next day, having worked into the early hours of the morning, but she was glad she had. Not only was it a useful spell, but it was something she had learned with her own ability, without the help of the powers left to her. Miss Potter. Professor Flitwick said, and Holly blinked back to awareness. She had been halfway between sleep and wakefulness in Charms class. Yes, Professor, she asked. Professor Dumbledore would like to see you tomorrow night for another lesson. He asked me to pass along word that you will be leaving the castle, Flitwick said, and Holly nodded. Something about that phrasing, she was sure whatever Dumbledore had in mind, it wasn't just a lesson. Thank you, Professor. I'll be sure to be prepared, Holly said, and then started practicing her locomotion charm like she should have been doing for the last half hour. Chapter 96, Year 5, Chapter 23. Chapter Text. Holly arrived at the door to Dumbledore's office after dinner, as the torches on the walls threw the corridors of Hogwarts into a flickering orange half-light. She had her basilisk skin coat on over her uniform, the magic woven into its inner lining keeping it perfectly sized for her, her wand in the wrist holster Ginny had given her, her cloak in her pocket, and Sirius's enchanted pocket knife in her other pocket. She was as prepared for whatever Dumbledore had in mind as she could think to be. The gargoyle guarding the door stepped aside as she approached, and the spiral staircase carried her up to the inner door. The gargoyle seemed to recognize her these days, whatever magic enchanted it allowing her through. She knocked on the inner door, and it swung open with the barest creak. Dumbledore's office was as littered with small wonders and bizarre machines as ever, the fireplace bright and warm. Fawkes, fresh from a burning and with ash still staining his pale feathers, sat on his perch. Dumbledore himself was sitting behind his desk, his quill moving with surprising haste over a hovering roll of parchment. What Holly was most surprised to see, however, was that the sword of Gryffindor had been moved from its place on the wall to a horizontal mount on Dumbledore's desk. It had a scabbard now, too, as rubijelled and silver as the legendary blade itself. Professor? Holly asked, and Dumbledore looked up. He seemed almost surprised to see her for a moment, and then seemed to realize the time. Ah, my apologies. It seems I had been rather too absorbed in my correspondence, Dumbledore said, standing from his chair and picking up the sword by its scabbard. He slid it into his belt, the sword much more reasonably sized for the tall man than it had been for her when she'd drawn it out of the hat. Have you found one? Holly asked, sure now why Dumbledore had summoned her here like this. He still hadn't really explained to her what Horcruxes were, and she had kept her promise not to look for information about them, but a part of her burned to know what they truly were. Mere memory could not cast spells, or possess others. I have. In fact, I believe it is right where we last saw it, in the ancestral home of the Gaunts, Dumbledore said. But, weren't the Ministry crawling all over Little Hangleton after the graveyard? Holly asked, even as a part of her shivered from the memory. Even as a part of her still felt drawn to the wild, untamed magic she had called on there. They did indeed search every part of the town, scouring it for any traces of magic. To this day, the old Riddle Manor is set with more alarm wards and tripwire jinxes than most of the vaults of Gringotts. What I find most curious about that, however, is that in all the reports filed by Cursebreakers and Unspeakable Slenderers, none of them mentions searching the Gaunt house, Dumbledore explained, and Holly began to see where he was going. That'd be the first place they'd look. It's right on the ley line Voldemort used to power his return, it's the house the side of his ancestry he likes to talk about was from. And yet, not one of the many well-trained and competent investigators even glanced at it. I imagine the thought of that brought him great amusement, as fortunate as it for us that Voldemort is so enamored by poetic meaning, Dumbledore said, and Holly nodded. The smart thing to do with a Horcrux was to put it in a bank vault somewhere or hide it at the bottom of the ocean, not ward your ancestral home against detection. Even the best ward could be broken if a witch knew it was there. Do you think the rest of them are hidden in places like that, sir? Holly asked, and Dumbledore nodded. Almost certainly, or in the hands of particularly trusted Death Eaters. I have a few leads on further locations, One I suspect is hidden in a cave on the coast that Voldemort visited as a boy, for example. But such discussions can be had after we have destroyed the ring, my dear. If you would take my hand. Dumbledore asked, extending a hand to Holly. She took it, and the two vanished with the barest sound. They reappeared at the edge of Little Hangleton, the Muggle village itself still brightly lit and bustling. It had, from what Holly had read, become a moderately successful tourist destination in the years since the murder of the Riddles. She could see the hill that the Gaunt house had once been on from the edge of the village, separated from it by a deep valley. The house itself seemed to have been lost in an explosion of a thick wild forest all across the hill. Even as thick and dark as the forest was, Holly thought she should still have been able to see the stone tower from here, if not the house itself. I can't see it, Holly said, almost surprised. She had known that the house was now hidden by wards and enchantments, but she had seen this view before in Bob Ogden's memory, knew where it should be. She tried to look closer, but each time she did she felt something push her away, only slightly. If she hadn't been trained in occlumency, in shielding her mind, she would not have remembered trying at all. Voldemort has hidden it well, but we have two advantages that will prove crucial. Firstly, there is no being that Voldemort trusts enough to make into a secret keeper, so the Horcrux cannot be under the Fidelius charm. Secondly, whatever wards conceal the house, they must be anchored to the nexus of ley lines that meet here, Dumbledore said, as the two of them walked towards the hill, and Holly was momentarily confused. Sir, all wards like that have to be anchored to something. I'm not sure why that's an advantage for us, Holly said. It is not an advantage for me, yes, but it is an advantage for you. You have a connection to this place, to the magic here. Focus on it, and I believe you will be able to find your way past the protections shrouding the house from view, Dumbledore said. Holly closed her eyes and felt the magic around her. She murmured incantations and felt the shift in the wind. She listened to the noise of the gently swaying trees. The sheer terror and despair, hearing her parents talk to her, the magic burning in her veins. She felt that sensation again, only less so, or perhaps a memory of it. She felt the magic of this place, not the wards and enchantments placed here by one wizard after another, but the ley lines. The veins of magic running through the world itself. She had touched this place, this connection between the two of them, and that mark would follow her forever. She opened her eyes and saw the old shack on the hill. The dilapidated stone tower, and long incomplete stone circle. Only, she turned her head slightly and looked in the way Dumbledore had taught her to do. She peered past a cleverly layered veil and saw the stone circle, restored with new stone, glowing softly with power. I see it. He's restored the stone circle and must have used that to anchor the wards, Holly said, feeling the unpleasant sensation of wild magic prickling underneath her skin. I suspected as much. Still, to see past such illusions at your age, at any age, is no simple achievement. Come then, Miss Potter, we have quite a walk ahead of us, and, I think, it would be wise to keep our wits about us. Voldemort may be arrogant, but he would not leave so vital an item as a Horcrux to be guarded only by wards and illusions. I suspect further defenses await us closer to the house, Dumbledore said, and they continued on their way towards the forest. Holly could feel the magic grow more ordered as she approached the hill, feel how Voldemort had used the ancient structure of the Tone Circle to anchor very modern wards. The forest itself was almost impenetrably thick, with twisted and gnarled branches blocking their way. Thorned vines were coiled around the trees, seeming almost to move in the half-light of evening. She raised her wand to cut a way through, but Dumbledore gently placed a hand on her wand arm. We should take care to avoid magic unless necessary. If there are guardians waiting for us inside, Voldemort will surely have enchanted them to respond to magic. To him, there is no other power, Dumbledore said, and drew the sword of Gryffindor from its scabbard. He swung once with the silver blade, which cut through old wood and twisted vines like mist. The vines hissed and burnt as the poison absorbed into the sword's goblin silver killed them. Holly saw them weakly move as though to attack, but the poison was too deadly even for magical plants. I guess it's good for gardening, as well as killing basilisks, Holly said as the two of them walked deeper into the forest. Dumbledore chuckled lightly, but his grip on the sword was still firm. The forest, now that Dumbledore had cut his way through some of the vines and trees, seemed to part before them. Holly could feel it, the magic of the place, as though it was alive. As though it could think. She knew that was just the magic Voldemort had cast to protect his Horcrux, of course, that he had enchanted the forest to give way to the worthy, in his own twisted definition of the term, or something like that. A vast and wild-looking hedgerow seemed to rise out of the forest as they neared the house, but it lacked any leaves at all. It was composed of dead, dry wood that ground and twisted against itself with an awful noise. Spikes and claws of that same bone-white wood extended from every surface, that looked sized to tear any foolish witch into very small pieces. I believe that whereas the outer protections were charmed against magic, this layer would, Dumbledore began, but Holly wrenched her gaze away from him as she heard something moving in front of them. Bloody corpses, wearing Muggle clothing, were dragging themselves out of gaps in the hedgerow. Some were freshly dead, and others seemed to have rotted in the damp ground for years. These were Inferi, corpses animated by dark magic. "Professor!" Holly shouted, not understanding why he wasn't reacting. "Miss Potter?" Dumbledore asked, confused, as the Inferi shambled closer and closer to them. He must not be able to see them, Holly realized, and she moved in front of Dumbledore and whipped her hand around in a circular motion. Fire blossomed from it, and she lashed at the shambling dead once and then again and again. Her flaming whip cut through rotten flesh and old bone, and many of the Inferi caught fire as flames licked up their ragged clothing. "Sir, Inferi!" Holly shouted by way of explanation, as yet more of the animated dead emerged from the hedgerow. She could feel the dark magic within it now, like a pulsating, sickening thing. One crawled under her flaming whip, and so she dismissed it and hit it with a powerful blasting curse. Dirt and wood exploded outwards, even as Holly shielded herself and Dumbledore. Of course, they must be hidden by the wards just as the house is. "Destroy the hedgerow, Miss Potter, and quickly." "Fire will serve you best," Dumbledore said, as he conjured a circle of fire around them. The Inferi seemed to stumble back from it, and Holly took her chance. She hissed words in Parseltongue, and the scent of brimstone filled her nostrils. Fiendfyre erupted from her wand, and she ordered the cursed fire onwards. It consumed the dark magic of the Inferi greedily, each of them consumed in a burst of bright blue flame, and then the snakes set their fanged jaws on the hedgerow. It snapped and slashed at them, but the enchanted wood could do no damage to the creatures of cursed fire. They smashed and burned the dead wood, fire leaping from branch to branch, and then Holly had cut a path through the hedgerow large enough to drive a bus through. She gave one final command in Parseltongue, and her Fiendfyre devoured itself. The fires they had started still raged, but they were mere fire, not the destructive, cursed flame of Fiendfyre. They would burn, but water would put them out. Quite. "We should expect one final layer of defenses beyond this, Miss Potter," Dumbledore said, and as the smoke cleared they could see that beyond the hedgerow was the gaunt house, shack and stone tower and all. The stone circle, ruined in Merup's time, stood repaired and pulsating with dark power. A stone table carved not of the dark grey rock of the circle but pitch-black volcanic rock sat in the center of it. Holly could see the dark stains, even against the volcanic rock, of spilled blood. Dumbledore pointed his wand to the sky and spoke an incantation. With a jet of light, rain began to pour from the clouds overhead. Even as he and Holly stepped through the hole in the hedgerow and neared the gaunt house, the fires behind them had begun to die down. The hedgerow closed behind them, deadwood moving and twisting to form an impassable wall once more. Holly could feel more and more dark magic, like an oppressive haze in the air. She almost felt like she was wading against it, struggling to bypass some physical force. She could hear the whispers too, now, louder and louder and louder as she got closer to the house. There was a terrible thump 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 in her mind, like a heartbeat gone mad. She gripped her wand tightly, the warmth of the phoenix feather within it her only comfort as she walked deeper into the nexus of dark magic. Chapter 97, Year 5, Chapter 24. Chapter Text. The gaunt house looked much like it had in the memory Holly had experienced. A run-down shack, built over the bones of what had once been a manor. All that remained of the grand estate it had once been was an old stone tower, the top half missing and strewn across the ground. The stone circle pulsed malevolently, and Holly was sure that was the heart of the defenses Voldemort had set up here. "I am sure that our presence here will set off an alarm of some kind." "We must hurry, Miss Potter," Dumbledore said, and Holly followed behind him as they approached the house. She had her wand out, the tip glowing faintly as she felt the power of the leyline. Dumbledore waved his wand in a complicated pattern, speaking in a dozen different languages as he wove a complex thread of magic. The Gaunt house was even more heavily defended than the outside. Despite the power of the protections, they were easier for Dumbledore to defeat. Anchored to the stone circle, he could access them directly rather than from the boundary. Shadows and flickering orange lights danced in the air around the house, and then with a blood-curdling scream and a flash of green light, Holly felt the wards surrounding the house fade. "Will he have felt that?" Holly asked, and Dumbledore nodded. "He would trust no one else to anchor the wards here." "Be on your guard," Dumbledore said, and then the door to the house swung open on rusted hinges. The house's shadow seemed to grow longer and darker, and Holly felt a chill wind. There was no movement in the grass, or of the dead leaves that littered the ground. Something moved in the corner of her eye and Holly whirled around, a curse blasting apart part of the hedgerow. There was nothing there, just broken, dead wood, but she knew she had seen something. Some dark figure, covered by a familiar cloak. Professor, I'd swear there was something there," Holly said, and Dumbledore gave her an inscrutable look. "A Horcrux is a powerful dark artifact. I imagine it may have more subtle means of defense than this fortress of magic. Once inside, we may no longer be able to trust our eyes, or ourselves. You must destroy the Horcrux, Gaunt's ring, as soon as you see it. No matter what I order you to do, no matter what you see, destroy it," Dumbledore said, and he drew Gryffindor's sword from its scabbard. The gleaming silver blade seemed to give off a soft glow in the half-light and long shadows of the dusk, glittering as though it was in the midday sun. Holly took the sword and felt strength and warmth flow through her. Though it was still too large for her slight frame, she felt no effort in holding it with her left hand. Whatever magic Godric Gryffindor had worked into his sword, it seemed he had intended for it to be used alongside a wand. Holly and Dumbledore entered the Gaunt house, and she saw almost exactly what she had seen in the memory. There was no dust, no detritus. It was as if someone had plucked the rundown shack from the early 20th century and transported it to the present. She could almost hear the crackling of a low flame, the hissing of morphine and the cauldron bubbling as Merope stirred. The long wooden dining table was far too fine for its surroundings, dark wood marred and stained and still exuding the fallen nobility of the House of Gaunt. A threadbare tapestry, depicting their claimed ancestry, Slytherin himself was on there, of course, his name above a small moving portrait at the start of one branch. Snakes curled around his name, one of the few figures to merit such decoration. A man, Cadmus Peveril, started another, and Holly felt herself drawn to the image of a skeleton in a black robe, tall and hunched, carrying a scythe that stood behind his portrait. She started at it, wondering where she had seen that pattern before. Dumbledore moved suddenly, and Holly felt her trance-like state snap away. She saw him move, his eyes clouded and felt the magic ensnaring him. She cast a counter-curse, but Dumbledore's wand hand moved with lightning speed and deflected away her spell. She knew his target, of course. Sitting on the wooden dining table was an ivory jewelry box that had once been encrusted with jewels. All of them seemed to have long since been pried off, leaving the faded velvet inside it the box's only decoration. There was only one piece of jewelry inside, a chunky golden ring set with a pitch-black jewel. Shadows curled around it, and Holly heard the whispers. She felt them almost drown her, but she had lived with them for so long now. For her, they were an old wound, a weary companion, not a new terror. She knew Dumbledore could not be talked out of this, that the magic of the ring had a hold of him now. Holly tried to intercept him, to stop Dumbledore from reaching the ring, but he threw a simple blasting curse at her with a wave of his hand. She deflected it, the blade of Gryffindor's sword singing as it cut through the magic as easily as flesh. The sword seemed almost to have a mind of its own, guiding her hand. She cast a stunning spell, and Dumbledore rounded on her as he shielded himself. His eyes were clouded with shadow, and his face was locked in a rictus grin of horror. He moved like a poorly performed puppet, too slow and too fast all at once. The two of them cast spells at one another from a few paces away, far too close to dodge, and Holly felt fear seize her heart for a moment. Then, as she wasn't turned to a smear on the ground, she understood, whatever magic that compelled Dumbledore, it did not have the allegiance of his wand. It seemed particularly jealous, and his spells were not nearly so swift or powerful as she knew them to be when cast by his own will. Even a weakened Dumbledore was too much for her to defeat. His spells, though less than what she had seen, still had tremendous power. Holly's shield charms would not have held them off mere months ago, but her constant practice had paid off. She had learned not only from the Order but from the Whispers, from her own too sharp instincts. For a few brief moments, she and Dumbledore engaged in a furious duel. Deflected curses blasted apart the walls of the gaunt house, turning carefully preserved furniture into scrap and splinters. Fire licked up one side of the room, and still, Holly could not stop Dumbledore. He reached for the ring, and Holly remembered what she had seen in Lucius Malfoy's mind. She saw Draco's face melt once more as the locket overtook him, as he became nothing but a vessel. She remembered how Tom had terrorized the school with a first-year girl as a vessel. Holly moved, transforming into her raven form for just a few moments, and then returning before Dumbledore could blink. Such a ploy would let her dodge one spell, but that was all she needed. As Dumbledore's hand touched the ring, as the shadows that curled around it sank into his hand, carrying with them a deadly poison, she knew, Holly swung Gryffindor's sword. It struck the ring with an awful wailing sound, light spilling from the shattered ring just as it had from the diary. She swung again as Dumbledore stumbled back, shadows receding from his eyes. Her second strike hit the jewel, and the sword seemed to slide away from it to strike the gold once more. Metal hissed and bubbled as the basilisk's poison ate away at it as surely as flesh, and then the light shut off with one last scream. The shadows receded, and Dumbledore's eyes were clear. Sweat beaded down his face, and he grimaced in pain as inky darkness spread through the veins on his left hand. You must, he tried to say, but he hardly had the strength to stand, let alone speak. She knew what he wanted to say. Holly whispered in Parseltongue, and fire blossomed to life at the end of her wand. A serpent of roaring flame extended from it, and it moved at her command. It opened its fanged mouth and, with one triumphant hiss, it slammed them down on Dumbledore's left hand at the wrist. All that was left of it was a blackened stump, and Dumbledore sagged to his knees. I'm sorry, sir, Holly said, her voice leaving her. She had just crippled the one person who could stand against Voldemort, at least, if she had not killed him anyway. Dumbledore was an old man, and the dark magic of Fiendfyre was hard to heal. It was I who must apologize. I was too eager to, I did not take the defenses as seriously as I should have. Help me up, my dear, and let us leave, he said, and Holly helped him to his feet awkwardly. She gave him back the sword, and Dumbledore gingerly placed it in its scabbard with his one remaining hand. We need to leave, sir, if Voldemort arrives, Holly said, and Dumbledore nodded. I will attempt to apparate us. Destroy the stone circle, we have no time to find our way out of the forest, Dumbledore said, as Holly stepped out of the ruined house and looked at the circle of stones. She looked at the blood-stained stone table, and the whispers in her mind told her what it had been used for. Holly wove her wand above her head, and fire blossomed to life at the end of it. She called up a great serpent of cursed fire and commanded it to strike at the stone table. It rose up into the air, burning the grass under it as it moved, and then its fanged jaw closed on the table. There was an explosion of light and magic as all the wards and enchantments came undone all at once. The stones around the table exploded, but Holly had shielded herself with a powerful charm. The deadly shards of stone flowed around her, diverted by an unseen force. The snake vanished as she banished it, and then the smoke cleared. The stone table was melted and broken, but not annihilated as non-magical rock would have been. Fires raged all around the clearing, but the clouds were still dark. Rain pelted down, and Holly felt the chill against her skin. Then some of the rubble moved. She felt the line, spasm, a shiver running down the spine of the world. A hand, seemingly made out of rotting, dead wood, burst forth from the crack in the stone table. Melted iron streamed down its forearm, and then the shattered pieces of the table went flying. Holly deflected them away with a wave of her hand, the simple magic easy enough without a wand for her now. Beneath the stone table, at the exact top of the hill and the center of the wards, was a pool of liquid shadow. The hand and part of a forearm extended through it, the iron bars that had once covered it melting into the shadow. The arm touched the grass around it, and the grass died. A figure, a man made from dead wood and stinking of decay, pulled itself from the pool. Its eyes were pools of sickly yellow light, its mouth a toothless grin that stretched across its flat face. What a curious witch child. You stink of him. Come closer, "Come closer," the thing said in a sing-song voice, extending one long, bony hand towards her. Holly felt something grab at her, and she turned to see a tendril of deadwood from the hedgerow wrap around her ankle. She cut it off with a cutting curse and turned her wand on the figure from the pool. What are you?" she screamed, the tip of her wand still glowing a soft orange. Why does she not know? The child plays pretend with a pretend face. "Why do you burn my hill, my forest, child?" it asked, walking slowly towards her. More hands appeared out of the shadowy pool, and Holly decided that whatever it wasn't good. She whipped lightning at the creature, and it stumbled back as parts of its bark shattered under the blow. A thin line of dark scarring was left in the wake of her blow, but she saw the creature regain its fitting and the scar begin to disappear in moments. "Manners, no more manners up above," the creature said, shadows coiling around its outstretched arm. They flew towards Holly, tips like lances, and she threw herself desperately to the side. Another volley and she conjured a shield. It stopped a few, but more went through. Only her basilisk skin coat saved her, blunting the curse. She was still thrown off her feet, still felt like someone had slammed a cricket bat into her ribs, but she was alive. The creature grinned as it walked towards her, shadows coiling around it. Then there was a burst of light, and the creature screamed as conjured arrows slammed into it. The iron arrowheads burned its flesh, fire igniting across it, and Holly heard Phoenix' song as she saw Dumbledore walk out of the ruins of the gaunt house. His strength had returned to him, and his eyes were once more focused. "Whatever he has promised you, you will not find it here. Go back to your place under the earth," Dumbledore said, his voice strong and clear. The creature turned to face him, even as the fire burnt it, but Dumbledore conjured iron chains that wrapped around the creature and threw it back into the shadowy pool. The liquid hissed and boiled as the iron touched it, and Dumbledore cut apart the hands sticking out of it with a half-dozen blades of silvery fire he conjured out of thin air. With one more wave of his wand, he conjured a lattice of iron bars above the shadowy pool. Holly could recognize a dozen wards and enchantments covering it, and then Dumbledore covered the pool and bars both with earth. "Are you all right, Miss Potter?" Dumbledore asked, and she could see whatever strength he had drawn on fade. He was clearly still in great pain, still missing his left hand, but she couldn't help but feel reassured anyway. "I'll be all right, sir." "What was that?" she asked, and Dumbledore paused for a moment. "Something requiring more time to explain than we have here," he said, and held out his wand hand. She took it, and then the two of them disappeared from the hilltop without a sound. Chapter 98, Year 5, Chapter 25. Chapter text. Holly found herself back in Dumbledore's office, then about a second later she found herself holding the headmaster up. The smell of brimstone and burnt flesh was almost overwhelming, and Holly had to wrench her gaze away from the blackened and burnt stump at the end of Dumbledore's left wrist to stop herself from vomiting. The headmaster's strength seemed to have left him all at once, and his wand clattered onto the stone floor of his office as he tried to hold back the pain. She could feel the dark magic clinging to him, clinging to the both of them, like a stench. Her breathing was rapid, and she felt her muscle burn from the strain of carrying Dumbledore, who, thin as he might be, was still a very tall man. Holly got him to his chair, and Dumbledore let out a grateful, pained noise as Holly put him down. She fumbled with her wand for a moment, and then started to cast every healing charm she knew, and cursed as the whispers in her mind were singularly unhelpful. Still, she ran through a few basic spells, charms to numb the pain, jinxes to kill any infections. I'll go get Madame Pomfrey," Holly said as she slowed her breathing and managed to get herself under control. No. Snape first," Dumbledore said, each word clearly requiring a significant, painful effort to speak. "Expecto Patronum." "Snape, Dumbledore's been hurt." "Fiendfyre and a wasting curse," Dumbledore added, his voice weak and raspy. "And a wasting curse." "A powerful one," Holly finished, and moved her wand in a circular motion. A doe formed from silvery light burst into life from the tip of her wand, and Holly felt better merely for being in its presence. The stink of dark magic seemed to wash off of her, unable to withstand the light of the Patronus. The doe gave Holly a look for just a moment and then bounded out of the office at great speed. As it left, Holly felt her wand hand shake, the trance-like calm she always felt during danger fading away. She hated the feeling afterwards, the way her skin suddenly felt clammy and her hands unsteady. Fawkes' mournful cry split the air, his wings too small to lift him from his perch. For a moment she thought about carrying him over to Dumbledore, but then she remembered her reading on phoenixes after her second year. With his body still so early in its life cycle, Fawkes couldn't cry the healing tears of a phoenix, not until his feathers lost their pale coloration for his usual glorious red and gold. Still, she carried him over to Dumbledore anyway. His tears merely wet the ragged, burnt stump at the end of Dumbledore's left wrist, but his song, weak and high-pitched, still gave Holly some comfort. Dumbledore's eyes were hazy and unfocused, but she hoped Fawkes could get through to him. She felt pathetic. All her magic, all the secret might of a Dark Lord in her head, and what could she do for Dumbledore? Nothing but a few first-aid charms. She knew that dark magic, like whatever curse had touched him, and the fiendful she had used to destroy it, was resistant to most magic, but that didn't make her feel any better. Not even other dark spells could heal a curse wound that dark. She knew spells to relocate wounds and twist flesh, but none of them would heal Dumbledore. Holly didn't know how long it took Snape to arrive. It felt like an eternity to her, every second stretched out and out and out. The many clocks that littered the office ticked in an agonizingly slow rhythm, sounding more like a funeral march to her panicked mind than an orderly tick-tock. Her heart thundered in her chest, every moment making her panic more, and then she heard the door open. The sound seemed loud enough to deafen her and, for the first time in her life, Holly felt elated at seeing Snape enter a room. "Professor," she shouted, as though he would need directions across the room. His cloak billowed as he ran towards Dumbledore, and in her panicked state, Holly laughed a little. There was absolutely no wind, and the enchanted cloak just seemed so ridiculous. "What have you done, Potter?" Snape shouted, and she flinched back. She had grown so used to his reserved, awkward manner with her hat she had almost forgotten how frightening she'd once found him. "I had to. He asked me," she said, but Snape didn't seem to be listening. "He will live, at least. Go get Madame Pomfrey, Miss Potter, and then off to bed," Snape said, his voice leveler than his initial outburst had been. "I can help." "I think you've done quite enough tonight, Miss Potter," Snape said, and Holly looked away. They had destroyed the Horcrux and gotten away, she had stopped the curse from killing Dumbledore. Somehow, though, she still felt like a failure. Madame Pomfrey made her stay in the hospital wing, and Holly collapsed into one of the all-too-familiar beds there without bothering to change into her pajamas. As Pomfrey went running out of the hospital wing, Holly felt all her energy leave her. Whatever combination of desperation and adrenaline that had been keeping her up had faded, and sleep came almost as soon as she closed her eyes. Dumbledore was there when she woke, looking older and wearier than she could ever remember seeing him. His hand was bandaged, and his eyes seemed to lack their usual sparkle. "I'm sorry about your hand, Professor," she said, and he smiled faintly. "I did tell you to do it, my dear. Had you not, I would have surely died, either quickly, or over the course of a year or so. As it is, I shall lack my least favorite hand and count myself lucky," Dumbledore said. What was that thing?" "From underneath the stone table?" Holly asked. "Something better left forgotten. Where the lines of magic are strongest, where they are tapped, like at the Gaunt House, things from elsewhere find it easier to cross over," Dumbledore said, slowly and cautiously. "Dobby told me that wizards put iron bars on all the ways to other places, once," Holly said. "House elves are thought to have come from one such place, long ago. It is why they require the ritual of gift-giving to stay here and to touch iron without being burnt," Dumbledore said. "The spells wizards use to bind them do much the same. But you should give them their proper name, the dark curses used to bind house elves. Such spells are tolerated, even by all too many of our erstwhile allies against Voldemort, but make no mistake, Holly, to enslave another is a thing of the darkest magic," Dumbledore said. He didn't raise his voice, but his words were like iron, such was his conviction. Dumbledore didn't need to shout to make himself heard. "Is that why wards against apparition can't stop them?" Holly asked, after a moment. "Part of that is simply wizarding arrogance, but yes. Their method of apparition use is an entirely different principle from wizarding apparition. Any ward against it would need to be purpose-built." "The thing that emerged from beneath the stone table was not so benign a fairy as a house elf," Dumbledore said, but Holly couldn't keep a straight face. It seemed like such an unthreatening name for so terrifying a creature that it couldn't be anything but funny. Sorry, Professor, I know it's a serious topic, but it is a rather amusing name in this day and age. When one reads the histories of Godric Gryffindor and Merlin, however, that is what our illustrious forebears refer to them as. And who are we to tell Merlin his name, for the terrifying things beneath the earth and seas make children giggle? Dumbledore said. Holly laughed, if only for just a moment. It'll only get harder from here, won't it? She asked, her amusement fading. Voldemort has surely realized we know of his Horcruxes after breaching the woods at the Gaunt House, yes. But the more time he spends obsessing over the protection of his soul, the less attention he has for attempting to conquer Britain, Dumbledore said, and then left. Holly was released soon after, and she was able to attend breakfast with her friends. She could see that they were bursting with questions, but Holly didn't want to talk about the events of last night in the Great Hall for everyone to hear. I'll tell you after classes, I promise, Holly said, which they accepted. At least we'll be free of Umbridge today. She wasn't at breakfast, and the twins told me she's left the castle, Ron said contentedly as he enthusiastically cut into his bacon. She must be done with inspections by now. Maybe she'll leave, Holly said, though she knew it wasn't going to happen. Hopefully. I guess McLaggen will have to fill in for her, the GIT Ginny said. I don't know. I think this could be bad. She doesn't go home on weekends or after hours, she must be going somewhere. If she's at the Ministry, Hermione said, and Holly paled. Bloody Scrimger, Ron muttered. I've gotta go, I have divination. See you at lunch, yeah? Ginny asked Holly, then she kissed her on the cheek. It was a simple thing, but a thrill ran down Holly's spine all the same. Yeah, she said, smiling. 5 points from Gryffindor for that behavior, Miss Weasley, McLaggen said, strolling down the Gryffindor table with his wand out and his golden badge looking larger than ever. Holly saw the couple a few places down practically devouring each other's faces and fumed. She turned to stand up, but she felt Ginny's hand on her shoulder. It's not worth it, Ginny said softly, and then she left to climb all the way up to the divination classroom. What a colossal wanker, Ron said as soon as McLaggen was out of earshot. Lessons that day were not particularly exciting, theory in transfiguration, more theory in arithmancy, and a charm Holly could do in her sleep in charms. The whispers could give her the knowledge, of course, but without actually paying attention in class, she would never know the right questions to ask. They could give her knowledge, let her cast a spell or undo a curse, but they couldn't give her understanding. I think I left my potions book back in the common room, save me a seat at lunch, yeah, she asked Ron and Hermione. They gave her vague noises of agreement, and then Holly rushed out of the charms classroom. She'd have to hurry to get her book, get back to the Great Hall for lunch, and then get to potions. She was in such a hurry that as she was rushing down the 7th floor corridor, with the tapestry of dancing trolls, she nearly ran headfirst into Ginny. Holly only just managed to skid to a stop without sending her girlfriend flying. Ginny, she said in surprise, and then Holly saw the tiny figure standing next to her. Dobby. Holly, you have to see this. Dobby was showing me. Dobby was showing Miss Weasley a secret room, Holly Potter, Dobby said proudly. And how'd she manage to worm that out of you? Holly asked. I may have given him a special gobstone, Ginny said, grinning mischievously. It wasn't Fred and George's new product, was it? Holly asked, a grin forming on her face. It's a special gobstone, Dobby repeated. You have to see this, Holly, it's crazy, Ginny said, then she closed her eyes and started walking up and down the corridor. Holly had no idea what was going on, but a few moments later a door appeared opposite the truly awful tapestry. It was a sleek, simple thing, made of varnished wood without decoration. If Holly had walked past it, she'd never have suspected it belonged to some kind of secret room. Ha, Holly said, as Ginny opened the doors. Holly followed her in, and found herself in an exact copy of the Gryffindor common room, down to the discarded books and notice board. It's a second common room? Holly asked, uncertain. She could feel something. Some kind of magic, subtle and well hidden, but powerful. It is the come and go room, or the room of requirement, Miss Holly Potter, Dobby said proudly. The room of requirement, she asked, the implications rushing through her mind. All you have to do is ask it for something and it makes it. It can get big or small or whatever you need, Ginny said. Holly smiled, and she thought back to her conversation with Snape about the dueling club. She had a far better backup location than the Chamber of Secrets, now. Chapter 99, Year 5, Chapter 26. Chapter text. Holly, you need to see this. Ron shouted, as what seemed to be the entirety of Gryffindor House clustered around the house notice board bright and early on a Monday morning. Ron, who had by now shot up well past Holly, Ginny, or Hermione, was able to peer over the sea of students. Holly managed to worm her way through the crowd, her small stature and quick reflexes preventing her from any nasty collisions. She looked up at the notice board, which was full of mundane announcements she was familiar with. She'd even placed a few of them herself, advertisements for the dueling club. Something new had been added, though. A huge piece of parchment, fixed with an official ministry seal. By order of the High Inquisitor. All student organizations, societies, teams, groups, and clubs are henceforth disbanded. An organization, society, team, group, or club is hereby defined as a regular meeting of 3 or more students. Permission to reform may be sought from the High Inquisitor, Madame Umbridge. No student organization, society, team, group, or club may exist without the knowledge and approval of the High Inquisitor. Any student found to have formed, or to belong to, an organization, society, team, group, or club that has not been approved by the High Inquisitor will be expelled. Defacing or in any way altering this notice is a criminal offense under the Wartime Communications Act 1938, and may result in fines, wand snapping, or imprisonment in Azkaban. Educational Decree No. 24. Holly said a very rude word under her breath and tried to extract herself from the throng of students. She had to duck and dart a bit, but she managed to safely make her way out. Ron, Hermione, and Ginny were all waiting outside the crowd. It's Umbridge. She's disbanded the dueling club, Holly said. Dueling club? Mate, she's disbanded the Quidditch teams. She's disbanded the entire bloody league. Ron shouted, and Holly felt her stomach drop. She hadn't considered that, she'd just considered them a school institution. She can't do that. It has to be against the law to ban Quidditch. Ginny said, her voice edging into shrillness. I know the Quidditch team is important, but surely she'll let them reform. Parents would riot in the street if they didn't. No, this is pretty clearly aimed at the dueling club. Remember how you said Scrimgeour was terrified of Dumbledore, Holly? Hermione said. We were only starting the really important stuff. I thought we'd have more time, Holly said. Well, then you need to convince that nasty old toad to let you reform it, Ginny said, placing a hand on Holly's shoulder. Not calling her a nasty old toad where she can hear might be a good start, Ron said. Come off it, you wanker. It's not like she can hear us now, is it? Ginny said. I'm only saying, Ron said defensively, raising his hand's palm out. Ron is right, Holly. You need to be careful. Umbridge might speak down to us, but she's not stupid. She was one of Fudge's most dangerous political operatives, and there's a reason Scrimgeour plucked her back out of BOID, Hermione began, but she was interrupted by Holly. Is there really a ministry department called B.O.R.E.D? Holly asked. Hermione sighed and rolled her eyes. Yes, there is. The Bewildering and Onerous Records and Editing Department mostly handle the ministry's internal paperwork. What I was saying, though, was that you need to go and ask for the reinstatement with Snape. Maybe try and write to the minister, even if it doesn't succeed, Hermione said, but Holly didn't feel good about her chances. The minister doesn't trust me, because he doesn't trust Dumbledore, Holly said. But there is, Ginny began, then stopped as she realized that she was in the common room. Holly nodded at her, and Ron and Hermione gave them odd looks. What's that about? Ron asked. I'll tell you tonight, not here, though, Holly said. Classes that day were quiet and on edge, as if everyone in the castle was holding a breath and waiting for something to happen before exhaling. Holly felt them fly by, and after defense, she and Snape headed for Umbridge's office. Let me do the talking, Miss Potter. You are entirely likely to derail the matter by screaming at her, Snape said, and Holly bristled. I'm not my father, and you shouldn't. I wasn't saying you were. Your father, as cruel and mean as he was, did not have nearly as powerful a temper as your mother, Snape said, stiffly. Holly blinked, not quite sure how to process what she'd just heard, other than mentally filing Snape's words about her father as the latest in a long line of lies. 2 hit wizards, dressed in their distinctive uniforms, stood guard outside Umbridge's office. "Halt, and identify yourselves," the more senior one said. "Professor Severus Snape and Miss Holly Potter, here to discuss the matter of the dueling club with Inquisitor Umbridge," Snape said, his voice cold. The younger hit wizard, Holly thought, had definitely had potions with Snape. The 2 guards cast a number of dark detection charms Holly, and she was sure Snape too, could have bypassed in their sleep, then stood aside. "You may enter," they said, and the door opened. Umbridge's office had once been a classroom and had a spectacular view of the lake. The first room, the former class space, was fitted out almost like a courtroom rather than anything else. The dark wooden paneling, benches, and high podium seemed at odds with Umbridge's sense of aesthetics. Behind the podium was a door painted bright pink with a gold cat's paw knocker, Umbridge's inner sanctum. As Holly and Snape entered the outer office, the pink door swung open on its own, revealing the room beyond. It was an explosion of pink cats, and pink cats. Every inch was covered either with pink wallpaper or carpet, and seemingly hundreds of small plates with moving pictures of cats painted onto them dotted the walls. "Severus, Mr. Potter. A pleasure." "Please, sit," Umbridge said, and Holly bristled. Snape gave her a warning glance, and she sat down without speaking. "Thank you for seeing us, Dolores," Snape began, his tone far more cordial than any Holly could remember. Umbridge interrupted him, clearing her throat first. "I do hate to jump in with a point of protocol, but as I am the High Inquisitor of Hogwarts, the correct way for you to address me is," Umbridge said, her voice sickeningly sweet. Snape paused for a moment and then continued. "My apologies, High Inquisitor," Snape said, his voice almost a growl. "There, isn't that better? Everything in its proper place. I can guess why you've come to see me, of course, your little club," Umbridge said. "As the defense against the dark arts," Snape began, but once again Umbridge interrupted him by clearing her throat. "I'm afraid it won't be able to continue, Severus. Teaching outside the prescribed curriculum, group combat drills. This just won't do," Umbridge said. "What we're teaching is important. In case you haven't noticed, there's a war going on. People need to be able to defend themselves." Holly said, unable to sit quietly any longer. "The Ministry will defend the people of this nation, not school teachers or boys of questionable morals. You will not use this school to raise an army against the Minister, and you most certainly will not be allowed to reform your club." Umbridge said, her own voice raised to match Holly's. Holly had been able to ignore the attacks on her, she was used to that. People had spent years calling her Pervy Potter and any number of worse things. What she couldn't ignore was Umbridge putting her fellow students in danger out of bizarre paranoia. Holly glared at her, all pretense of politeness forgotten. "Very well then, High Inquisitor. The Minister may expect a letter," Snape said, stiffly, and stood. Holly got herself under control and stood to follow Snape out of the inner office, but Umbridge cleared her throat, and Holly turned around. She'd known it was stupid. She knew that even before she'd finished the turn. She'd have been better off just ignoring Umbridge and walking out of the office. "Do behave yourself, Mr. Potter," Umbridge said, her voice just as syrup-like and aggravating as ever. Only now Holly wasn't trying to convince her to do something. "If I happen to run into a Mr. Potter, I'll pass that along." "Dolores," Holly said. "You will learn to mind your manners, Mr. Potter," Umbridge said. "You will show respect to the High Inquisitor, and you will cease this disobedience. 20 points from Gryffindor, and the next time it will be detention," Umbridge said, and Holly rolled her eyes. She had long since stopped caring about house points, and whilst she wouldn't choose to write lines or scrub cauldrons, she'd faced far worse. Later that evening, Holly and Ginny showed Ron and Hermione the room of requirement. Ginny, who had a real knack for getting the room to give her exactly what she wanted, had turned it into a huge training area, much better than even the ones Holly and Snape had been able to set up. "This is wicked," Ron said. "You haven't seen the half of it yet. It can do all sorts of crazy stuff. I've got it to do everything from home to the common room to this giant lost and found," Ginny said, grinning. "The room might be large enough to hold the entire dueling club, But we'd never sneak so many people into here without Umbridge noticing, Hermione said. I know. We could still run it with the most, reliable people. At least continue teaching them what the Ministry won't let Snape teach them in class, Holly said. We'd need to make sure people didn't tell, Ginny said. I have a few ideas, Hermione said, her expression unusually sly. Holly had long since worked out that Hermione could be vicious if she wanted to be. I'll bet, Ron said. With the map, it shouldn't be too hard to avoid any patrols. Plus you two have access to the prefect patrol schedules, Holly said. Only the Gryffindor ones, Hermione said, shaking her head. Really? Holly asked. Fred and George steal a copy every year from each house, though, Ron said, and Holly grinned. So we've got a plan, yeah? Ginny asked, and Holly nodded. We just need to get started without Umbridge catching on, or giving her a reason to come down on us, Hermione said, and Holly caught her meaning, that it was Holly who had to be cautious most of all. Start getting the word out to people you trust, once Hermione has her precautions ready. We'll need to do it one at a time since there's not another Hogsmeade weekend until Valentine's and we can't meet openly in the castle, Holly said, to a general chorus of nods. Over the next week, Holly tried to keep out of Umbridge's way and avoid her goons. That was easier said than done. The whole point of them was that they were students, and she'd once again been seated next to McLaggen at a Slug Club event. It was another stuffy dinner, though thankfully with fewer guests than the one the minister had attended. The converted, disused classroom had been transformed ably by the house elves, and the long table was covered in an elegant tablecloth. The plates, goblets, cutlery, all of it was much finer than the usual for Hogwarts. Drapes had been raised to cover the bare stone walls, and floating candles provided the lighting. Some of the seventh years, those who were 17, were drinking wine. Several expensive-looking bottles floated off to the side of the table, filling up any empty goblet. And of course, now that we have Professor Sloane teaching potions, I've been able to showcase my true talents, McLaggen said, as Holly rolled her eyes and concentrated on her Duckell orange. The food served at the Slug Club events was always much fancier than even the feasts at Hogwarts, but the quality was the same. She did appreciate knowing what the stuff her aunt served to guests actually tasted like, though. Not just potions, my boy, I've heard you've shown quite some improvement as a duelist. Sloane said, excitedly. Well, haven't we all? There is a war on, after all, one must be prepared. Once I've got my NEWTs, I'll be heading out with the Auror office to show those Continentals why they made a mistake attempting to bring their savagery here. Cormac said, attempting to strike his best heroic pose whilst in the midst of eating dinner. That you will, my boy, no doubt about it. I am interested, of course, in what our resident duelist thinks of your skills. Miss Potter, how would you rate Mr. McLaggen? Sloane asked, his cheeks rosy from the deep, blood-dark wine in his crystal goblet. We've never duelled, Sir, Holly said, cautiously. She wanted to say that a real dark wizard would eat him alive, though she was sure Cormac was probably good enough to give a decent account of himself. Hermione's words, and Snape's, were ringing in her ears as answered. I think you'd find I know a few tricks even you don't, Potter, McLaggen said, his smirk just as irritating as ever. I'm sure you would, McLaggen, Holly said, biting her lip to stop herself from continuing and insulting him. Now that's a match, a friendly match, I'd like to see. Say, Miss Greengrass, I've heard your father has emerged as, Sloane said, and Holly returned to focusing on her food. As the dinner wrapped up, Holly slipped out quickly. Sloane was well and truly drunk by now, but she was still working her way up to a conversation about Horcruxes, so she didn't want to stick around and take advantage of the fact. All she wanted to do was to get back to the common room and sit in front of the fire, perhaps cuddling Ginny. A panicked scream caught her attention, snapping her out of her post-dinner haze, and Holly's wand was in her hand with barely a flick of her wrist. She dashed towards the sound at a full sprint, nearly sliding around the corner of the corridor. She found a first-year boy being magically suspended by his ankle, screaming and crying as two much older students, a boy and a girl Holly didn't recognize, menaced him. The girl was holding her wand up, clearing the one casting the spell, whilst the boy shouted something at the first year. Before she'd even considered the scene, her wand was flying into motion. Holly's disarming charm slammed into the girl like a rugby player, sending her flying backwards and her wand spinning into the air. Before the wordless disarming charm had even landed, Holly cast a softening charm on the floor so that when the girl's spell failed, the kid she'd been suspending in the air landed with a soft bounce rather than a hard thump. The older boy turned to face her, his wand in his hand, and that was when Holly noticed the Inquisitorial Squad badge on his robes. "Stupefy," the boy shouted, more out of instinct than anything else according to Holly's legilimency. She stepped to the side, her mastery of mind magic allowing her to read his spell before he'd even begun to cast it. At such a short range, with no cover, it was the only way she could have dodged his spell. Their duel lasted only a second, Holly's disarming charm landing before the boy could conjure even a basic deflection. His wand went flying, and the boy staggered backwards from the force of Holly's spell. She plucked his wand out of the air, and looked at the two Inquisitorial Squad members with all the rage she felt visible on her face. "What in Merlin's name were the two of you doing? Picking on some first years? You think it's funny," she shouted, and the two of them backed away a little. The first year looked up at her, his eyes wide. "This is none of your business, Potter." "We were inspecting him for contraband," the girl said. "I've never heard of a dark detection charm that involved lifting someone up by their ankles," Holly said. "Detention. Detention for the both of you," the boy shouted, his panic evident in his voice. Holly blinked. "Do you really think Dumbledore will approve of what you've been doing? Say you give me detention, and then I appeal it to the headmaster. How do you think that'll go? Dumbledore isn't in charge here, not anymore. You'd do well to remember that, Potter," the girl said. "Last time I checked, the headmaster overruled a pair of wannabe prefects when it came to detentions," Holly said, and then she threw the boy's wand at him. It landed in front of him, and he scrambled to pick it up. The two of them glared at Holly but left swiftly. Holly knelt down to give the first year a hand up, which he took a little shakily. "You all right there?" she asked. I'll be fine," he said. "Good lad. What's your name?" "Harry, miss." "Harry Cook," he said, his cheeks flushing. Holly laughed, and he did too, if a little nervously. "Let's go see the headmaster, Harry. He'll sort those two out," she said, and led him up to Dumbledore's office. Dumbledore soon had little Harry calmed down and sipping from a mug of hot chocolate. All punishments handed out to the two of them were reversed, and Dumbledore then sent Harry off to bed. "Will you be able to punish the two of them?" Holly asked him after Harry had left. "For now. I suspect that Umbridge may be seeking a confrontation along these lines, but I have no choice in the matter. The safety of the students must come first," Dumbledore said, and Holly thought he suddenly sounded much more tired than he had when Harry was in the room. Sure enough, Holly found a new ministry notice the next morning in the center of the Gryffindor notice board. Educational Decree 25 gave Umbridge, as the High Inquisitor, the final say over all student discipline. Holly saw McLaggen standing by the entrance, and he gave her a smirk. "Detention tonight, Potter. 5 o'clock, with the High Inquisitor," he said, and Holly felt an odd sensation of unease. Surely, she thought, McLaggen wouldn't be so smug over Holly writing some lines or scrubbing cauldrons. Chapter 100, Year 5, Chapter 27. Chapter Text. Holly arrived at Umbridge's office, with its large courtroom-like outer room and violently pink inner sanctum, at 5 o'clock on the dot. Harry Cook had clearly been there for some time, sitting on the uncomfortable wooden benches outside the office and trying not to look nervous. He seemed so small, though she wasn't that much taller than him. The first year had sandy blonde hair and bright blue eyes. His Hufflepuff robe seemed almost to swallow him up. "It'll be all right," Holly said to him quietly as she sat down next to him on the bench. "Kevin Phillips said that Umbridge turns people into frogs for detention," Harry said, not looking at Holly. "Transformative punishment is banned at Hogwarts," Holly said, which was true. It had been one of Dumbledore's first acts as headmaster, long before corporal punishment had been banned in the 1980s. Harry didn't say anything after that, and Holly took the opportunity to rest her eyes for a moment. She was utterly unconcerned. None of the punishments allowed in the Hogwarts bylaws was really anything more than unpleasant or annoying. She'd faced the worst torture magic could devise, more than once. Compared to the Cruciatus Curse, detention with Umbridge could only be less. "Mr. Potter, Mr. Cook," Umbridge said from her inner office. Holly walked into the outer office and saw that a pair of ordinary desks and chairs had been placed in the center. Each had a large piece of parchment and a quill but not an ink pot. Self-inking quills weren't unheard of, you could get one for a sickle at Diagon Alley prices, but Holly didn't think Umbridge would be the type to make her detentions any easier. "Good evening, Mr. Potter," Mr. Cook, Umbridge said, her voice as falsely upbeat as ever. "Good evening, High Inquisitor," Holly said, deciding to take a page from Snape's book. A sentence she'd hoped to never think for quite some time, but these were desperate times. "I see we're already learning to mind our manners." "Well, sit down," Umbridge said, and Holly sank into one of the seats. Something about this whole situation was making her uneasy. It was like she could see the shadow of the anvil about to drop on her head, just around the corner. The quills themselves were odd. Long and dark, with sharp points. Holly hadn't seen anything similar in a wizarding stationery shop. "Today, children, we'll be writing lines. Mr. Cook, you will write 'I will respect my betters.' Mr. Potter, you will write 'I will mind my manners,'" Umbridge said, her tone of voice bizarrely happy. How many?" little Harry Cook asked, his voice inches away from trembling. "Oh, long enough for it to settle in," Umbridge said, and for the first time, her smile reached her eyes. They were a piercing blue, and Holly had to stop herself from drawing her wand. All of her instincts were screaming at her that she was in a confined space with something dangerous, even as she saw a middle-aged woman in a pink cardigan give her lines. Holly picked up her quill, and she felt a little ill. It had magic, yes, but it was no self-inking quill she'd ever heard of. She wrote out "I will mind my manners" on the parchment in front of her and hissed in pain. The words had appeared on her hand, cut thin and fine as if by a scalpel in the hands of a surgeon. Even as she looked, the wound healed, but it was harder to heal a wound inflicted by magic, and even harder to heal one inflicted by dark magic. Harry Cook started to cry, holding his hand in pain. He looked at Holly, fear in his eyes, and she felt her heart sink. He was transparently only here because she had intervened, he was only here to be used as a prop. "Harry wasn't involved in the fight," Holly said, the polite tone tasting like vomit in her mouth. "Is that true, Mr. Cook?" Umbridge asked, her smile almost a leer. He looked to Holly and then Umbridge, and Holly hoped desperately that he would just say yes. Holly could smell the blood drying on the parchment in front of her. No. I was being insolent and disrespectful," Harry said, and Holly was both proud of him and mad at him. It was a stupid, foolish thing to do. There was no reason for him to get in trouble for her. She appreciated it all the same. Umbridge looked between Holly and Harry for a moment, her eyes narrowing as if considering some great question. She cleared her throat and stood up, looking down at Harry and Holly from her raised position. "It is your first time in detention, Mr. Cook, as opposed to a serial troublemaker like Mr. Potter. And, of course, you do have superior breeding. I suppose I can consider this a warning in your case. Since Mr. Potter claims he bears sole responsibility for the assault, he will also serve your detention," Umbridge said. Harry began, but Holly cut him off. There was a time for bravery and a time for good sense, she thought. Something she knew she often failed to recognize in herself. "I appreciate you sticking up for me, Harry, but I was the one who started the fight." "Go on and get to bed," she said, smiling at him slightly. He didn't say anything for a moment, and she knew he wanted to argue, to insist that making Holly serve his detention was blatantly unfair. For a moment Holly thought he was going to, but, in the end, he just wished them both a good night in a hesitant voice and left. "Well, Mr. Potter, shall we return to writing lines?" Umbridge said, and Holly said nothing. She only returned to her parchment and sank into her occlumency. She emptied her mind, sinking into the semi-meditative state that the most powerful forms of that art demanded. She was determined not to give Umbridge the satisfaction of seeing her in pain. At first, it was only really a mild stinging sensation, unpleasant and surprising, but not all that painful. As the night wore on, as hour after hour marched on by, each cut became more painful, and took longer to heal. The magic of the quill seemed to be literally sinking into her skin, fighting whatever healing spell was also placed upon it. Umbridge sat in her high judge's chair, pretending to do paperwork even as leered down at Holly. She kept her face still and unmoving, unwilling to give Umbridge the satisfaction of seeing her in pain. Unwilling to admit that the constant pain relief pain did hurt, that even if each line did hurt only a little, the sheer mindless, endless, infinite repetition was close to driving Holly mad. Holly thought about stopping. About simply standing up, cursing Umbridge, and walking out. She would surely be expelled, of course, and probably arrested. Dumbledore might have forgiven such a thing, especially during such a harsh punishment, but Umbridge would call in the errors the instant Holly was gone. So Holly would have to obviate Umbridge. Harry Cook would know that she had been in detention, as would the 2 Inquisitorial Squad members and probably the rest of the squad, along with everyone involved in the educational decree. Perhaps a powerful Confunder's charm combined with a memory charm might let her make Umbridge think Holly had served out her detention, but Umbridge had once been a senior undersecretary. Ministry workers at that level were trained to recognize and report memory alterations. She still considered hexing Umbridge and leaving, but she knew that if she did she would be leaving Hogwarts as well. Living at Grimmauld Place with Sirius and Remus year-round didn't sound so bad, but she'd be leaving behind Ginny. She'd be leaving behind Ron and Hermione. She'd be leaving behind all of her other friends and Quidditch and going outside without a half-dozen guards. Beyond all that, beyond anything it would cost her, Holly knew that she'd be letting Umbridge win. She would be letting Umbridge drive her from the castle, letting her clear another obstacle from the board for the minister. All Umbridge could do to Holly was inflict pain and be rude to her. She was a petty tyrant who thought she could break Holly's will with demeaning words and a little pain. She was a pathetic, bitter, bigoted loser and Holly would not let her win. So Holly wrote and wrote and wrote, ignoring the pain. The smell of iron seemed almost overwhelming as line after line appeared on the parchment, Umbridge barely pretending to write reports as she watched Holly. Holly missed dinner fairly soon into the detention, which was surely intentional. She was hungry and tired, and surely so must Umbridge have been, but neither of them wanted to back down and so there they sat for hour after hour. Finally, after the sun had long since dipped below the horizon and the bells had rung for midnight, Umbridge stood. "Show me your hand, Mr. Potter," she said, and Holly raised the back of her hand without speaking. She was sure if she spoke, she would say something so awful and rude that she and Umbridge would come to blows. The skin was red and irritated, but Holly was fairly confident that it would fade before the morning. It seems that a second detention is an entirely wise course of action. Well, do get to bed, Mr. Potter. Tomorrow, 5 o'clock sharp, Umbridge said, and Holly got out of her seat and walked towards the door. She walked back to Gryffindor Tower almost in a daze, tired and hungry and with a stinging ache in her right hand. She was technically out of bounds without a note from a teacher, but evading prefect patrols was second nature to her by now and she managed to avoid the 2 of them she knew were in her way. "And what were you doing out so late, young lady?" the fat lady asked Holly, her hands on her hips. "Detention," Holly said wearily. "Detention? Why?" the fat lady began, but Holly was in no mood to have a conversation with a portrait when there was somewhere soft to lie down on and a warm fire awaiting her inside. "Mimbulus Mimbletonia," Holly muttered, and the portrait swung aside. She hurried into the common room and was surprised to see several people still there, keeping the fire well tended. Ginny, Ron, and Hermione had all clearly waited for Holly, sitting around the couches near the fire and turning as Holly entered. "Merlin, she kept you a little long for detention, didn't she?" "What, she have you scrub every cauldron in the dungeons without magic?" Ron asked. "She had me write lines," Holly said, and Ron blinked. "How many?" he asked, puzzled. "I don't think she had a specific number in mind," Holly said. She'd hoped to sound dryly sarcastic, but it came out flat and tired. Is everything all right, Holly?" Ginny asked as she came over and gently took Holly's hand. Then she noticed the angry red marks on it. Holly thought for a moment about denying what had been happening, about keeping this entirely between Umbridge and her. But Ginny had been so open with her, and she had told her friends a far deeper secret and benefited so amazingly from it, that she had to tell her. "Umbridge has some kind of quill that cuts and heals your hand when you write with it," she said, and Ginny's eyes went wide. "That's awful," she said. "Let me help," Hermione said, withdrawing her wand and casting a healing charm Holly didn't know. The pain in her hand did lessen a little, and the redness faded some. "Thanks, Hermione," Holly said even as Hermione frowned. "That should have fixed all of it, not only some of it. That quill could be dark," Hermione said, and Holly nodded. I guess, yeah, she said, her tiredness robbing her of eloquence. Right, it's past midnight, let's just get up to bed so you don't fall asleep in potions, Ron said, and Holly smiled. Actually, I'm bloody starving. You don't have, Holly began, and then almost as if she'd called him, Dobby appeared with a soft pop of displaced air. Is Miss Holly Potter being back? Oh. Dobby said, as he noticed Holly. She smiled at him. Hello, Dobby, she said, smiling at him. Hello, Miss. Dobby noticed Miss's friends waiting up for her, and they told Dobby that Miss was not at dinner. Would Miss like some food? Dobby asked, and Holly could have hugged him. Yes please, Dobby, although anything will do. Please don't wake up the kitchen elves just for me or something like that, Holly said. Not to worry, Miss. It is nearly time for the night shift's meal, and if Miss does not mind, Dobby will get some of that for her, Dobby said, a little hesitantly. Holly, who would have eaten a roast prowler piglet, teeth and all, at this point, nodded. That's fine, Dobby, and please, call me Holly, she said, and Dobby looked at her with wide eyes and a wider smile. He disappeared right after that and returned 30 seconds later. Holly hadn't been sure what she'd expected house elves to eat, but whatever she had expected, it wasn't what Dobby was holding. The smell alone was like nothing she could remember, and she saw a half-dozen cuisines in one little elf-sized dish. It was an explosion of colors and flavors, a mad whirlwind of different foods all combined in odd ways. The kitchen elves is liking to experiment, Miss, I mean, Holly, Dobby said, and she smiled at him. I can see that. Thank you for bringing me this, Dobby. Would you like to eat some with us? Holly asked. Dobby nodded shyly, and she, Ron, and Dobby sat around one of the low tables near the fire and dug into the bizarre elf food. Ginny and Hermione headed to bed, but Ron couldn't resist the allure of the bazaar, and soon Holly thought he was glad he'd stayed. Dobby had great fun telling Holly and Ron about each dish, which all had long and complicated histories involving individual kitchen elves, some of which seemed to be part of great feuds between lineages of kitchen elves. From the way he told it, Holly guessed that he was telling her the house elf equivalent of scandalous gossip. After perhaps half an hour, Holly stumbled up into her bed feeling far better than when she had arrived at Gryffindor Tower. Even Umbridge, she thought, could not make Hogwarts unbearable for her so long as she had her friends with her, human and house elf alike. Chapter 101, Year 5, Chapter 28. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. The fifth-year girls' bathroom was shared by all three rooms, sitting at the center of an arrangement that couldn't possibly fit into the tower. The years below Holly's were even larger, the post-war baby boom picking up the slack from the war years. The furnishings in the bathroom were all charmed bronze, carved with lions. Quite a few girls walked out of the showers, steam wafting behind them, and Holly kept her focus firmly on the mirror in front of her. Not out of any lingering sense of awkwardness, years of living in the girls' dormitory had cured her of any anxiety over that. No, Holly stared at her mirror to avoid looking at Hermione's concerned face as her friend stood beside her. You need to tell Dumbledore, Holly, Hermione said as the two of them got ready in the morning. Holly's hand had healed overnight, but it was still a little sore as she cast a few simple makeup charms. She didn't use as many as Lavender or Parvati, but Holly wasn't as dismissive of them as she'd once been. Cosmetic charms were an art of their own, subtle and hard to get right. They had the advantage over Muggle makeup of being removable with a simple fint, though Holly thought, I will. But Educational Decree 20 whatever says Umbridge has control over all student discipline. Fighting her on this is what she wants, Holly said, braiding her hair into something more suited for defense with a wave of her wand. Surely she can't expect to win. Forcing students to write lines in their own blood. It's barbaric, Hermione said. To you and me, maybe. But you know how purebloods are, Hermione. They probably don't see it as any worse than caning or whatever, and my uncle was always whining about bringing it back, Holly said. Holly, you don't need to just bear it out of some stupid sense of Gryffindor pride. Hermione shouted. None of the girls getting ready for the day so much as blinked, as Snape's anti-eavesdropping spell was disguising Holly and Hermione's conversation. I can't just go and curse her, can I? You didn't see her, Hermione, she was waiting for me to ask her to stop, to give in. Now she knows she was the one who backed down first, Holly said. That is the dumbest thing I have ever heard. She can just keep giving you detention. What if your hand stops healing? What if she starts giving other people detention? What if she gives you or Ron or Ginny detention? I need to keep her focused on me, Holly said. And what if she does both? Hermione asked, and Holly gave her a sharp look. I don't have the answer to everything. I can't just curse society into being better, Holly said, dejectedly. The whole country is obsessed with you. The Prophet won't stop going on about the girl who lived. You could fight Umbridge in the press, Hermione continued. Holly bit back a hasty retort as she considered Hermione's words. That's a good idea. Although I'm not sure the Prophet would print anything critical of the Ministry.